got loyalty, got royalty inside my DNA. I got killer beats, got war and peace inside my DNA. I got poison, pain, and joy inside my DNA.
Hello and welcome back to my channel, FIC Fantasy. Today, we're kicking off the second part of our series, What If Tanjiro is Captured by Muzan? The author of this story is Orion Pax 1 from AO3. Now, let's dive into the fanfic. Hours had passed, but Tanjiro's battered and weary body could barely muster the strength to move. His nose crinkled in disgust as the acrid stench of his own vomit assaulted his senses, the metallic tang of BLD and the cloying, sour smell of his overturned stomach contents lingering in the stale air of the cell. With a trembling hand, Tanjiro wiped the dried saliva and crusted BLD from his chin, his movements sluggish and his limbs aching. Slowly, he pushed himself into the farthest, coldest corner of the cramped space, curling in on himself as a shiver of discomfort ran through his frame. Nuzzling his nose into the familiar fabric of his sleeve, Tanjiro inhaled deeply, his eyes burning with unshed tears as the comforting sense of his friends and companions enveloped him. How he longed to be with them, to feel the warmth of their camaraderie and the strength of their bonds. The boy's heart ached as he recalled the laughter they had shared, the stories they had told, the way their presence had always filled him with a sense of purpose and belonging. Now, trapped in this cold, dark cell, Tanjiro felt utterly alone, adrift in a sea of despair and uncertainty. He wished he could feel that familiar warmth in his chest, the one that had always accompanied the sight of his friends and the knowledge that he was not alone in this fight against the demons. But here, in the suffocating darkness, that warmth had been snuffed out, replaced by a cold, pervasive dread that threatened to consume him. Tanjiro's trembling fingers gripped the fabric of his sleeve, as if holding on to the faint remnants of his friend's sense could somehow tether him to the life he had left behind. He yearned for their laughter, their support, their unwavering determination, anything to chase away the shadows that now threatened to envelop him. The boy's eyes burned with unshed tears, his heart aching with a profound sense of loss and longing. He had come so far, fought so hard, all in the hope of protecting his beloved sister Nezuko and breaking the curse that had taken hold of her. Tanjiro's eyes began to brim with tears once more, the crushing weight of his isolation bearing down upon him with unbearable intensity. His fingers trembled as he raised a hand to hastily rub at his face, desperately trying to stifle the flow of emotion. But the tears refused to be contained, spilling down his bruised and battered cheeks. His hair, once neatly tied back, now clung to his sweat-dampened brow, a testament to the suffering he had endured. The once vibrant purple bruises that had marred his skin were now beginning to fade, while the small cuts and scrapes that had torn his flesh were slowly knitting themselves back together. But the physical wounds were nothing compared to the anguish that tore at his heart. Tanjiro's eyes, red-rimmed and weary from endless hours of crying, searched the dim confines of his cell, desperately seeking some respite from the relentless torment. His body ached, the stench of dried BLD, sweat, and bile clinging to him like a noxious shroud. Pressing his eyes closed, the young warrior longed for the blissful embrace of sleep, to escape the horrors that continued to haunt his waking moments. But elusive as it was, slumber remained ever beyond his grasp, leaving him to toss and turn, shivering and shuddering as the cold of his confinement seeped into his very bones. After what felt like an eternity, Tanjiro finally gave up his futile attempts at rest, rising on unsteady legs to pace the confines of his cell. With each step, the sound of his footfalls echoed through the cramped space, a stark reminder of his isolation and the hopelessness of his situation. 6 steps forward, 6 steps back, the endless, monotonous rhythm of his movements, a desperate attempt to find some semblance of control in the face of the overwhelming uncertainty that loomed before him. Muzan's chilling words, the ominous promise of darkness that would soon consume his very soul, haunted his every thought, sending shivers of dread down his spine. Tanjiro longed for the warmth and camaraderie of his companions, the familiar laughter and unwavering determination that had once filled his heart with hope. But here, in this cold, unforgiving cell, those precious memories felt like a lifetime ago, taunting him with the knowledge that he might never experience that joy again. The young warrior's shoulders sagged with the weight of his burdens, his spirit crushed by the relentless onslaught of despair and uncertainty that threatened to swallow him whole. But even in the face of such overwhelming adversity, a glimmer of determination still flickered within his heart, a stubborn refusal to surrender to the darkness that encroached upon him. With each step, Tanjiro steeled his resolve, drawing upon the fiery resilience that had carried him through so many trials. He would not, could not, give in to the demons that sought to break him. For Nezuko, for his friends, for all those who depended on him, he would find the strength to endure, to overcome, and to emerge from this nightmare as the warrior he was destined to become. Tanjiro's chest heaved with a deep, seething hatred that threatened to consume him from within. The acrid stench of blood, the very sight of demons, the oppressive confines of this wretched place, all of it ignited a raging fire within his soul, a pure and unadulterated loathing that seemed to burn hotter with each passing moment. And at the very center of this maelstrom of emotions stood Muzan, the demon lord whose very existence was an affront to all that Tanjiro held dear. Gritting his teeth, the young warrior unleashed a torrent of the most vile curses, spewing forth a litany of vitriol that targeted not only Muzan himself, but his vile offspring as well. Tanjiro railed against the demon's impeccable appearance, his cool demeanor that seemed impervious to the anguish he had wrought. Oh, how Tanjiro longed to have his sword in hand, to finally deliver the justice that had so long eluded him. To watch the light fade from Muzan's eyes, to see the demon lord's arrogance crumble to dust, it was a fantasy that consumed Tanjiro's every waking thought. But alas, he was powerless, stripped of his weapons and his strength, forced to endure the agonizing helplessness that threatened to shatter his very being. As the initial flames of his rage slowly subsided, Tanjiro felt the weight of his despair settle upon him like a heavy cloak. A deep, aching sorrow welled within his chest, and he sighed heavily, his shoulders slumping with the burden of his captivity. Reaching up, he grasped one of his earrings, the thin, glossy Hanafuda card glinting in the dim light of his cell. This simple, precious trinket, a heirloom of his lost family, had survived the trials Tanjiro had endured, a testament to the resilience of the bonds that connected him to his loved ones. A flicker of hope ignited in his heart, a reminder that even in the face of such overwhelming darkness, the light could still find a way to shine through. With renewed determination, Tanjiro gently pushed the earring back into place, the familiar weight and warmth of the adornment grounding him, reminding him of the reasons he had to fight. For Nezuko, for his friends, for all those who depended on him, Tanjiro would not, could not, succumb to the demons that threatened to break him. His grip tightened on the earring, the edges of the card pressing into his palm as a fresh wave of resolve washed over him. He would endure, he would persevere. And he would emerge from this nightmare stronger and more resolute than ever before. Muzan and his ilk may have taken his freedom, but they would never take his spirit, his determination, or his unwavering commitment to protecting the innocent. Tanjiro's weary body ached as he slowly lowered himself to the cold, hard ground of his cell, his back pressed against the unyielding surface of the wall. With a heavy sigh, he brought his arm up, using it as a makeshift pillow to support his head, hoping to find even the slightest bit of comfort in this bleak and unforgiving place. As he shifted his position, trying to find a more tolerable posture, he winced, the soreness and strain in his muscles a constant and unwelcome reminder of the trials he had endured. With painstaking care, he crossed his legs, tucking them beneath him in a futile attempt to alleviate the discomfort. Tanjiro's eyes slid shut, and for a moment, he allowed himself to drift, to distance his mind from the harsh reality that surrounded him. In the darkness behind his eyelids, he sought solace, longing for the peaceful dreams that had once offered him respite from the waking nightmare of his captivity. But the peace proved elusive, the ever-present specter of his suffering always lurking, ready to shatter any fleeting moments of tranquility. Tanjiro's brow furrowed as he struggled to find even the slightest measure of rest, his mind racing with a torrent of emotions, the all-consuming hatred for Muzan, the burning longing for vengeance, the overwhelming sense of helplessness that threatened to suffocate him. Yet, amidst the turmoil, a glimmer of hope remained, a flicker of light that refused to be extinguished, no matter how relentless the darkness seemed to be. Tanjiro knew that he could not, would not, give in to the despair that sought to claim him. He had too much to fight for, too many people counting on him to fulfill his destiny as a demon slayer. With a renewed determination, Tanjiro took a deep, steadying breath, willing his body to relax, if only for a moment. He focused on the familiar weight and warmth of the earrings that adorned his ears, a tangible reminder of the love and support that awaited him beyond the confines of this wretched place. As he clung to that lifeline, Tanjiro allowed his consciousness to drift, not into the restful slumber he so desperately craved, but into a state of quiet contemplation, a mental respite that would fortify him for the trials that lay ahead. For in the darkness, he knew that the light still burned brightly, a beacon that would guide him home, no matter how long and arduous the journey might be. A deafening bang echoed through the dimly lit cell as the heavy iron door slammed open, the jarring sound sending shockwaves of alarm through Tanjiro's already frayed nerves. His head snapped up, eyes wide and alert, as the ominous silhouettes of two demons filled the entryway, dragging a limp, lifeless form into the room. Tanjiro watched in horror as the demons unceremoniously dropped their cargo to the ground, the dull thud of the impact causing his heart to leap into his throat. Before he could even process what was happening, one of the demons delivered a savage kick to the side of the motionless figure, eliciting a pained groan that tore at Tanjiro's very soul. As the demons turned and departed, Tanjiro's eyes strained to make out the details of the crumpled form now lying at his feet. Tanjiro's breath caught in his chest as he recognized the unmistakable cascade of dark hair spilling across the floor. Cautiously, he reached out, his fingertips trembling as he gently rolled the figure onto her back. A strangled gasp escaped his lips as the distinctive features of Makio, one of Tengen's wives, came into focus, the vibrant yellow of her bangs now dulled and matted, a stark contrast to the pallor of her skin. Tanjiro's heart raced, a cold dread gripping him as he took in the sight before him. What had these demons done to her? Was she even still? He swallowed hard, fighting back the overwhelming wave of fear that threatened to consume him. With a shaky hand, he reached out, pressing two fingers against the side of her neck, praying to feel the reassuring flutter of a pulse. Time seemed to stand still as he held his breath, every second feeling like an eternity as he waited for some sign of life. The moment of agonizing suspense was shattered by the faint, but unmistakable, throbbing beneath his fingertips. Tanjiro exhaled sharply, relief washing over him, but the sense of dread still lingered. What had happened to Makio, and what did it mean for the others? His mind raced, trying to piece together the implications of this disturbing turn of events. Tengen and his wives were formidable fighters, seasoned demon slayers in their own right. If something had happened to Makio, what did that portend for the rest of the group? Tanjiro's grip tightened on Makio's limp form, a renewed determination coursing through him. He had to find a way to escape, to warn the others, to ensure that no more lives were lost to the darkness that had enveloped them. The stakes had just been raised, and failure was no longer an option. With a deep, steadying breath, Tanjiro set to work, carefully assessing Makio's condition and doing everything in his power to ensure her survival. His resolve had never been stronger. He would not rest until he had freed himself and his comrades from this hellish captivity. The coppery stench of Bl-du permeated the air, assaulting Tanjiro's senses as he took in the horrific sight before him. Makio's clothing was soaked with the crimson fluid, the dark stain spreading across the fabric as it continued to seep from the grievous deep wound in her side. Tanjiro's heart raced, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and determination as he assessed the severity of her injury. He could see her organs. Some had started to spill out from it as crimson blood seeped into her clothing. Makio's chest rose and fell in shallow, ill-bred breaths, the pallor of her skin a stark contrast to the blood that marred her features. Tanjiro could see the sheen of sweat glistening on her brow, a testament to the agony she must have been enduring. Wasting no time, Tanjiro swiftly moved to her side, his hands trembling as he searched for the source of the bleeding. His fingers grazed the jagged, open wound on her flank, and he immediately pressed down, applying firm pressure in a desperate attempt to staunch the flow. Makio let out a pained whimper, her eyes fluttering open to reveal a glassy, unfocused gaze. Tanjiro's breath caught in his throat as her gaze slowly settled on him, recognition dawning in her features. Tanjiro, she breathed, her voice barely above a whisper. Is that you? She paused, wincing as she tried to shift her position, a low groan escaping her lips. Lady Makio, please, you need to stay still, Tanjiro urged, his voice laced with concern. You're bleeding heavily, and I need to stop the bleeding. He pressed down harder, feeling the warm, sticky blood seeping through his fingers, a sinking feeling of helplessness settling in the pit of his stomach. Tanjiro's heart sank as he watched the realization dawn on Makio's features. The weight of their dire circumstances seemed to crush her, her eyes widening in horror before dulling with resignation. Tears spilled down her pallid cheeks, a shuddering breath escaping her trembling lips. Tanjiro. Where are we? She asked, her voice faint and cracking. Tanjiro wished he didn't have to deliver this news, but he knew he owed her the truth. He hesitated, his throat tightening with dread. We are in the Infinity Castle. Makio's reaction was just as he had feared. Her eyes widened in alarm, the realization of their dire predicament sinking in. Tanjiro watched helplessly as the light in her gaze dimmed, tears streaming down her face as she let out a shuddering breath. They have been looking for you, she whispered, her breathing growing more labored with each passing moment. Tanjiro's heart sank as he watched the pool of crimson around them continue to grow, the blood seeping through his fingers despite his desperate efforts to stem the flow. Your friends. Even the other Hashira have been searching for you, Makio continued, her voice barely above a whisper. A faint, bittersweet hum escaped her lips, and Tanjiro felt a lump form in his throat, knowing that she was slipping away. The color was draining from Makio's face, her breathing growing louder and more ragged. Tanjiro felt the weight of their situation crushing him, the realization that he might not be able to save her filling him with a paralyzing sense of dread. Hang on, Makio, he pleaded, his voice trembling with desperation. Please, you have to keep fighting. I won't let you go, I swear it. He pressed down harder on the wound, his fingers slick with her life's blood, but the bleeding refused to slow. Makio's eyes fluttered, her gaze barely focused as she looked up at him. Tanjiro, she breathed, her voice barely audible. I'm so sorry. I couldn't stay with you. Tanjiro felt his heart shatter at her words, the guilt and anguish he had been suppressing threatening to overwhelm him. No, Makio, don't apologize, he choked out, his vision blurring with tears. This isn't your fault. I'm the one who should be blamed. The sound of Makio's labored breathing filled the air, a stark contrast to the eerie silence that surrounded them. Tanjiro knew that time was running out, and he frantically searched his mind for any solution, any glimmer of hope that could save her. Tanjiro's heart shattered as he watched the warm blood seep from Makio's wound, the crimson liquid staining his breaths and knees as he desperately tried to stem the flow. His fingers trembled as he pressed harder, but the bleeding refused to stop. Please, hang on, he begged, his voice cracking with anguish. I'll find a way to save you, just a little longer. Please. Makio's eyes were starting to glaze over, her breaths growing more labored by the second. Tanjiro felt his own heart racing, the weight of their dire circumstances crushing him. Tanjiro. Makio's voice was barely above a whisper, her features etched with resignation. There's nothing to be done. She shuddered, and Tanjiro watched helplessly as she slowly raised her shaky hand. Just hold my hand, she breathed, her fingers reaching out to him. Tanjiro grasped her hand immediately, holding it like a lifeline as he gazed into her eyes, willing her to keep fighting. Makio's breaths were growing slower, moral bred. Tanjiro watched as her eyes fluttered, the light in her gaze beginning to dim. He gripped her hand tighter, his own tears threatening to spill over. With a small, bittersweet smile, Makio gave his hand a gentle squeeze. Tanjiro felt the breath leave his lungs as he watched the last vestiges of life slowly fade from her features, her body going slack in his arms. A strangled sob escaped Tanjiro's lips as he curled over Makio's lifeless form, holding her close. The weight of his failure, the realization that he couldn't save her, crashed down upon him like a tidal wave. In the eerie silence that surrounded them, Tanjiro's anguished cries echoed, a testament to the devastating loss he now faced. He had promised to protect her, to keep her safe, and now she was gone, slipping through his fingers like grains of sand. Tanjiro clutched Makio's hand, his tears falling like rain upon her pale features. The realization that she was truly gone, that he would never hear her voice or see her smile again, filled him with a profound sense of despair. "I'm so sorry," he whispered brokenly, his heart shattered beyond repair. I couldn't save you." The Infinity Castle, once a looming, foreboding structure, now felt like a cruel, inescapable trap, a testament to Tanjiro's inability to change the tragic course of events that had unfolded before him. In the crushing silence, Tanjiro's anguished sobs that soon turned to loud wails, were the only sound that pierced the veil of darkness, a testament to the depth of his grief and the weight of the loss of a mother figure, he now carried. Tanjiro sat there for what felt like an eternity, his heart shattering with every passing second as he cradled Makio's lifeless body in his arms. The warm blood that had once flowed so freely from her devastating wound had long since dried, leaving behind a grim reminder of the tragedy that had unfolded. His tears had run dry, his throat raw from the anguished sobs that had racked his frame. The streaks on his cheeks were the only remnants of the grief that had consumed him, a testament to the depth of his sorrow. Tanjiro felt numb, more so than he had ever been before. His mind drifted, conjuring memories of simpler times, Makio's infectious laughter as they played their favorite games, the way her eyes would light up with joy when Hinetsuru and Suma joined them. He remembered the times they'd gather for tea, the easy camaraderie and casual conversations that had once filled their lives. Even Tengen, the ever-present but distant figure, would sometimes pass through and ruffle Tanjiro's hair affectionately before bestowing his girls with a loving kiss and departing on another mission. Those moments, once cherished, now felt like a cruel, unattainable dream. Tanjiro knew, deep in his heart, that nothing would ever be the same. The void left by Makio's absence was a chasm that could never be filled, a gaping wound that would forever ache. He had promised to protect them, to keep them safe, and now one of them was gone, lost to him forever. Tanjiro's heart sank as he realized he had never closed Makio's eyes. Her lifeless gaze stared up at the ceiling, a haunting reminder of the tragedy that had unfolded. Slowly, with a trembling hand, he reached out and gently pressed his palm over her eyes, sliding them shut. She looked as if she were merely sleeping, were it not for the large, dried pool of blood surrounding her. Tanjiro sat in the dimly lit cell, his heart heavy with an unbearable sorrow that threatened to consume him. The lifeless form of Makio lay before him, a stark reminder of the tragic consequences of his defiance. As he stared at her motionless body, a single thought took root in his mind. With a trembling hand, Tanjiro reached out and gently brushed his fingers against the strands of Makio's neatly tied back hair. The soft, silky texture brought a fresh wave of grief crashing over him, and he felt his heart shatter all over again. Without hesitation, he began to carefully pluck several dozen strands from her head, each one a painful reminder of the young life that had been so cruelly snuffed out. Tanjiro then turned his gaze to the vibrant red skirt that Makio had been wearing, the fabric now stained with the indelible mark of her blood. With a heavy heart, he tore a long strip from the garment, his fingers trembling as he carefully rolled the strands of Makio's hair into a small, delicate rope. Painstakingly, Tanjiro began to braid the red fabric and Makio's hair together, weaving them into an intricate, sorrowful cord. He worked with meticulous care, as if each movement could somehow undo the tragedy that had occurred. When he had finished, he gently tied the bracelet around his own wrist, ensuring that it was tight enough to remain, but loose enough to not dig into his already bruised skin. The sight of the red, yellow, and black bracelet on his arm was a heartbreaking reminder of the girl he had so desperately tried to protect. Tanjiro felt the weight of his grief crushing him, the tears he had been holding back finally spilling down his cheeks as he stared at the tangible piece of Makio that he now clutched. This small, NTMT act of remembrance was all he had left of the vibrant young woman who had once been his closest companion. Tanjiro's heart ached with the knowledge that she was gone, her life stolen by the very demon he had sworn to destroy. The bracelet was a bittersweet testament to the love and loyalty they had shared, a final, desperate attempt to hold on to the memory of the girl he had failed to save. As Tanjiro sat in the oppressive silence of the cell, the weight of his loss threatened to drown him. The bracelet on his wrist was a constant, painful reminder of the price of his defiance, a burden he would carry for the rest of his days. Tanjiro retreated to the furthest corner of his cell, his eyes bloodshot and swollen from the torrent of tears he had shed. He closed his eyes, desperately praying that this was all just a horrific nightmare, that he would wake up and everything would be as it was before. But the acrid stench of death lingered, a constant, agonizing reminder of the harsh reality he now faced. Tanjiro sat there, unmoving, his mind a whirlwind of memories and emotions, yet paradoxically empty and numb. The sound of slow, deliberate footsteps echoed down the hall, sending a spark of dread coursing through Tanjiro's veins. He wanted to move, to hide, but his body refused to respond, paralyzed by a fear he had never known before. The click of a key in the lock sent a shiver down his spine, and Tanjiro watched in trepidation as the cell door swung open. There, silhouetted by the flickering torchlight, stood the demon lord himself, Muzan. Tanjiro's head snapped up, his bloodshot eyes meeting Muzan's unwavering gaze. The demon lord's lips curled into a malicious smile, his words dripping with a sinister edge. "You haven't touched your meal," he drawled, his voice sending a chill down Tanjiro's spine. Tanjiro's brow furrowed in confusion, his voice trembling as he uttered the single word, "What?" Muzan's eyes gleamed with a twisted amusement. "The girl," he said, gesturing towards Makio's lifeless form. "Her flesh and blood, that is your sustenance now." Tanjiro felt bile rise in his throat, the realization of Muzan's implication shattering his already fragile psyche. He wanted to scream, to lash out, to do anything to prevent the unthinkable, but his body refused to obey, paralyzed by a fear he had never known before. The flickering torchlight cast long, ominous shadows across the cell, as if the very walls were closing in, suffocating him with the weight of his grief and the crushing despair of his situation. Tanjiro's heart pounded in his chest, the sound of his own blood rushing in his ears deafening. Muzan stepped closer, his footsteps echoing ominously in the confined space. "Come now, Tanjiro," he purred, his voice dripping with false concern. "You must be famished. Indulge yourself, take what is rightfully yours." Tanjiro's eyes darted around the cell, searching desperately for a means of escape, a way to defy this horrific demand. But the cell was bare, save for Makio's lifeless body and the ever-growing pool of blood that surrounded her. The acrid stench of death filled the air, choking Tanjiro, reminding him of the unforgivable tragedy that had unfolded. He wanted to shut his eyes, to block out the nightmare, but he found himself frozen, unable to tear his gaze away from Muzan's malevolent stare. The demon lord's patience seemed to wear thin, his expression darkening as he growled, "Eat, or suffer the consequences." Tanjiro's revulsion and fury bubbled to the surface as he spat out the words, "F you," his voice dripping with disgust. Muzan's lips curled into a sinister grin as he let out a slow, deliberate breath. The demon lord's serpentine eyes glinted with malice. "I don't think you quite grasp the gravity of your situation, child," he sneered. "You are in no position to defy me." Tanjiro watched in horror as Muzan turned his back and bent down, his clawed hand reaching out to Makio's lifeless form. With a sickening crunch, the demon lord tore a jagged chunk of flesh from her cold, pale arm. Tanjiro's breath caught in his throat, a wave of nausea washing over him at the sound. Muzan rose to his feet, the palm-sized piece of Makio's flesh glistening with blood in his grasp. He turned back to Tanjiro, his piercing gaze boring into the boy's very soul. Slowly, he lowered himself onto one knee, extending the grotesque offering towards Tanjiro. Tanjiro recoiled, shoving his face into the crook of his arm, his own limbs wrapped tightly around his knees in a desperate attempt to shield himself from the horror unfolding before him. The acrid stench of blood and death permeated the air, choking him, as his body trembled with a mix of revulsion and pure, unadulterated terror. "Eat," Muzan commanded, his voice dripping with a twisted authority. Tanjiro squeezed his eyes shut, willing this nightmare to end, but the reality of his situation refused to relent. The sound of Muzan's slow, deliberate movement sent a shiver down his spine, and he knew that defiance would only invite more unspeakable horrors. With a trembling hand, Tanjiro reached out, his fingers brushing against the warm, slick flesh that Muzan held. Bile rose in his throat, and he fought the overwhelming urge to vomit as he grasped the chunk of Makio's body, his heart shattering all over again. Muzan's twisted smile widened, a gleam of triumph in his eyes as he watched Tanjiro's resolve crumble. The boy's world had been reduced to this single, unthinkable act, and the demon lord reveled in the despair that consumed him. Tanjiro's entire body trembled with a mix of unbridled rage and sickening dread as he glared defiantly at Muzan. Turning his hand over to drop the stick flesh, it hit the ground with a small splat. "I will never," he breathed, his voice quivering with effort, "drop to your level." The demon lord's piercing gaze locked onto Tanjiro, his eyes narrowing to slits as he studied the boy's unwavering resolve. Muzan could sense the anger boiling in Tanjiro's chest, a roiling storm of emotion that threatened to consume him. Yet, beneath that fury, the demon lord detected a wave of nauseating revulsion that threatened to break the young man's fragile composure. The two adversaries stared each other down, the tension in the air thick enough to be cut with a blade. Tanjiro refused to back down, his eyes burning with a defiance that refused to be extinguished, even in the face of this monstrous demon. Muzan's lips curled into a slow, predatory smile as he rose to his full height, towering over the captive boy. "You are a foolish child," he hummed, his voice dripping with condescension. Tanjiro's heart pounded in his chest, the sound echoing in his ears as Muzan turned and strode towards the heavy cell door. The demon lord's footsteps seemed to reverberate, the finality of his departure crushing Tanjiro's spirit. As the door slid shut with a resounding thud, the young man felt the weight of his situation bear down upon him, the crushing despair of his predicament threatening to drown him. Alone in the dim, flickering light, Tanjiro's resolve wavered. He had stood up to the demon lord, had refused to submit to his horrific demands. But at what cost? The lifeless form of Makio lay before him, a silent testament to the price of defiance. Tanjiro's eyes burned with unshed tears as he stared at the girl he had sworn to protect, her once vibrant spirit now extinguished. The acrid stench of death permeated the air, choking him, reminding him of the unforgivable tragedy that had unfolded. Tanjiro wanted to scream, to rail against the unfairness of it all, but his voice caught in his throat, strangled by the weight of his grief. As the reality of his situation sank in, Tanjiro's hands clenched into trembling fists, his nails biting into his palms. He had defied Muzan, had refused to give in to the demon's twisted demands. But at what cost? The lifeless form of Makio bore witness to the price of his defiance, a price that he feared he may yet have to pay. The passage of time had become a meaningless concept in the confines of Tanjiro's dimly lit cell. Each moment blurred into the next, as he found himself consumed by a never-ending cycle of physical and emotional torment. The gnawing pain in his stomach was a constant companion, a relentless reminder of his desperate need for sustenance. His hunger had become an all-encompassing force, leaving him lightheaded and disoriented, his senses dulled by the relentless ache. Tanjiro had spent countless hours pacing the small confines of his prison, his steps growing more and more erratic as the days or perhaps weeks wore on. Sleep had become a fleeting refuge, offering only temporary respite from the horrors that surrounded him. And there, in the center of his waking nightmare, lay the decaying form of Makio. The once vibrant young woman had become a macabre centerpiece, her skin peeling away as the relentless march of decay took hold. Flies had found a gruesome home amidst the pallid flesh, while maggots burrowed into the softening skin, feasting upon the remains of the girl he had sworn to protect. The stench was overwhelming, a suffocating miasma that clung to every inch of the cell and threatened to choke the life from Tanjiro. His stomach lurched and churned, the nausea a constant companion as he struggled to maintain his composure in the face of this unimaginable horror. Tanjiro's heart ached with a grief so profound that it threatened to consume him. Makio's lifeless body was a painful reminder of the price he had paid for his defiance, a price that had cut him to the core. He had failed her, failed to keep her safe, and now her once vibrant spirit had been snuffed out, leaving only a grotesque husk in its wake. With each passing moment, the reality of his situation grew more and more oppressive, weighing heavily upon his battered psyche. Tanjiro felt as if he were trapped in a waking nightmare, his only solace the fleeting moments of sleep that offered a temporary escape from the hellish reality that surrounded him. As he stared at Makio's decaying form, Tanjiro's resolve began to crumble. The weight of his grief, his hunger, and the ever-present stench of death threatened to overwhelm him, leaving him grasping for any semblance of hope in the endless void of his captivity. The walls of the dimly lit cell seemed to press in on Tanjiro, the oppressive atmosphere suffocating him with each passing moment. No matter how many times he paced the small confines, the distance from one end to the other never changed, a constant 6 steps forward, 6 steps back. This endless CYCL was a physical manifestation of the mental and emotional turmoil that consumed him. Tanjiro's throat burned with a desperate need for water, the lack of hydration only exacerbating the relentless aches that plagued his weary body. The constant stress and strain of his captivity had taken an unyielding toll, leaving him feeling physically and mentally drained. Each breath was a struggle, as if the very air itself was conspiring against him. Despite the overwhelming odds, Tanjiro refused to yield. He knew that he could not continue down this path indefinitely, that eventually he would have to concede defeat and submit to the will of his captors. But today was not that day. He clung to the faint embers of defiance that flickered within him, determined to hold out for as long as his battered body would allow. The thought of bowing down, of surrendering his pride and principles, filled Tanjiro with a sense of dread that threatened to consume him. He had come too far, sacrificed too much, to simply give in to the demands of those who sought to break him. Yet, the relentless onslaught of physical and emotional torment was slowly wearing him down, chipping away at the resolve that had once been his greatest strength. Tanjiro's gaze drifted to the decaying form of Makio, a constant and painful reminder of the price he had paid for his actions. Her lifeless eyes seemed to bore into him, silently condemning him for his failure to protect her. The guilt and sorrow that weighed upon his heart threatened to overwhelm him, the grief a crushing burden that threatened to shatter his already fragile psyche. Yet, even in the face of such overwhelming adversity, a glimmer of hope still flickered within Tanjiro. He knew that he could not give up, that he had to find the strength to endure, no matter the cost. The memory of Makio and all those he had sworn to protect fueled his determination, a flickering flame that refused to be extinguished by the relentless forces that sought to break him. As Tanjiro paced the cell once more, his steps growing more unsteady with each passing moment, he steeled his resolve. Today was not the day he would bow down, he would fight on, drawing upon the last vestiges of his strength to defy the darkness that threatened to consume him. Tanjiro's fingers traced the familiar shape of the bracelet on his wrist, a physical connection to the memory of Makio, the only source of solace in this bleak and unforgiving captivity. The odd texture of hair and fabric provided a grounding tactile sensation, a small but vital lifeline to the world beyond the confines of his prison. With a deep sigh, Tanjiro ran his calloused hands through his greasy, unkempt hair, grimacing at the unpleasant feeling. Though he longed to maintain his personal hygiene, the limited resources and cramped conditions of his cell made even the most basic of self-care tasks a challenge. The cold, damp air that permeated the space was a constant reminder of his isolation, a stark contrast to the warmth and comfort he had once known. Desperate to alleviate the crushing boredom that threatened to consume him, Tanjiro began to practice his swordsmanship techniques, his movements precise and controlled despite the limited space. The familiar forms and patterns offered a momentary respite from the suffocating monotony, but the need to constantly avoid the decaying corpse in the center of the cell made it a frustrating and arduous task. After several minutes of exhausting exertion, Tanjiro collapsed to the floor, his body spent. With nothing left to occupy his mind, he resorted to the one activity that had become a ritual of sorts, counting. Slowly, methodically, he counted from 1 to 1,000 and back again, his lips moving silently as he repeated the familiar numbers. Yet, even this simple task failed to provide the distraction he so desperately craved, the endless cycle of counting growing increasingly mundane with each repetition. Tanjiro hated this existence, this punishment that had been moved upon him. He understood, on some level, that his defiance had brought him to this wretched place, but the relentless boredom and anxiety that gnawed at the back of his mind were a torment of their own. Each day blurred into the next, the passage of time becoming increasingly irrelevant as he struggled to maintain some semblance of sanity in the face of such overwhelming isolation and despair. The corpse in the center of the cell was a constant reminder of the consequences of his actions, a grim specter that haunted his every waking moment. Tanjiro's heart ached with the weight of his guilt, the knowledge that he had failed to protect Makio, a burden that threatened to crush him. In the darkest moments, he found himself questioning whether his stubborn refusal to submit was truly worth the price he had paid. Yet, even amidst the overwhelming darkness, a flicker of defiance still burned within Tanjiro's soul. He refused to surrender, to allow his captors the satisfaction of breaking him. The ever-present anxiety that gripped Tanjiro's heart only seemed to intensify with each passing day. The distant, muffled sounds of demons echoing through the corridors beyond his cell sent his mind into a frenzy, his senses on high alert as he constantly scanned the shadows for any sign of Muzan's approach. In his weaker moments, Tanjiro found himself longing for the demon lord's return, if only to end the agonizing uncertainty that plagued him. Yet, even as his body craved the respite that death might bring, Tanjiro's stubborn spirit refused to surrender. He knew that such thoughts were merely the product of his deteriorating physical and mental state, a byproduct of the constant hunger and dehydration that gnawed at him. Whenever the urge to give in threatened to overwhelm him, he would force himself to focus on the memories of his family, the loved ones he had sworn to protect, a glimmer of hope in the darkness that surrounded him. Tanjiro sat in the far corner of his cell, his head resting wearily in his hand as he leaned against the cold, unyielding wall. His eyes were drawn to the flickering torchlight that danced through the barred window, a tantalizing glimpse of the world beyond his prison. With a deep, shuddering breath, he stretched out his aching back, the constant tension in his muscles a testament to the toll his captivity had taken. His stomach let out a faint gurgle, a dull, persistent ache that had long since become a familiar companion. Tanjiro knew that he needed to maintain his strength, that he could not afford to succumb to the ravages of hunger and thirst. Tanjiro's gaze drifted to the decaying form in the center of the cell, a grim reminder of the price he had paid for his defiance. Makio's lifeless eyes seemed to bore into him, silently accusing him of his failure to protect her. The guilt that weighed upon his heart was a crushing burden, one that threatened to shatter his already fragile psyche. With a heavy sigh, Tanjiro turned his attention back to the flickering torchlight, his mind racing as he tried to devise a means of escape. He knew that his chances were slim, that the odds were stacked against him, but the thought of surrender was one he could not bear to entertain. As long as he drew breath, he would continue to fight, to resist the forces that sought to break him. Tanjiro's body ached with a deep, unrelenting exhaustion that seemed to permeate every muscle and bone. The constant state of tension and alertness had taken a heavy toll, leaving him feeling more drained than he ever could have imagined. Yet, even in the depths of this weariness, he found himself unable to find solace in the oblivion of sleep. The air in his cramped cell was thick with the incessant buzzing of flies, a cacophony of sound that grated on his already frayed nerves. The distant, muffled howls and laughter of demons echoed through the corridors beyond, a constant reminder of the nightmarish reality that now surrounded him. Tanjiro felt as though he was trapped in a living nightmare, with no escape in sight. With a resigned sigh, Tanjiro curled in on himself, his head pressing against the cool, unyielding surface of the stone floor. His hands instinctively moved to his chst, feeling the gentle rise and fall of his own breath as he tried to steady his racing heart. Tanjiro knew that he needed to find a way to calm his mind, to center himself amidst the chaos that threatened to consume him. Closing his eyes, he attempted to slip into a state of meditation, drawing upon the techniques he had honed over the years. But the task proved to be an exercise in futility, as the constant barrage of sensory input and the turmoil within his mind refused to be quelled. Tanjiro's frustration mounted, and he found himself considering more drastic measures. The idea of slamming his head against the floor, of forcing himself into unconsciousness, began to take hold. The pain, he reasoned, would at least provide a temporary respite from the torment of his captivity. As he contemplated this desperate course of action, Tanjiro's mind raced, grasping at any semblance of hope or clarity. He knew that giving in to the temptation of oblivion would only provide a temporary solution, and that he would ultimately have to face the harsh realities of his situation upon waking. Yet, the lure of escape, even if only through the fleeting oblivion of unconsciousness, was a siren's call that grew ever more tempting with each passing moment. Tanjiro felt the weight of his captivity pressing in, the walls of his cell seeming to close in around him, suffocating him with the sheer hopelessness of his predicament. Tears stung at the corners of his eyes, and Tanjiro fought against the overwhelming sense of despair that threatened to consume him. He refused to give in, to let the demons, both literal and figurative, break his spirit. He had come too far, sacrificed too much, to surrender now. Tanjiro's body trembled with a relentless ache, the kind of exhaustion that seeped into the very marrow of his bones. Each passing day seemed to drain him further, the once vibrant spark within him dimming with every moment of captivity. The gnawing hunger that clawed at his stomach had become a constant, inescapable companion, a painful reminder of his powerlessness in this nightmare. His throat felt raw and parched, like a desert that had long since been drained of life-giving water. Tanjiro's very existence had been reduced to a battle for survival, a desperate struggle to cling to the last vestiges of his strength. The stench of rot and decay permeated the air, a constant assault on his senses that threatened to overwhelm him. Tanjiro's gaze was drawn, against his will, to the lifeless form of Makio, the sight of her ravaged body a sickening reminder of the horrors that had befallen them. The once vibrant eyes, now sunken and hollowed out, had been claimed by the endless swarm of flies that feasted upon her remains. Tanjiro could see the maggots burrowing through her skin, consuming her flesh and organs with a voracious hunger. The sight was enough to make his stomach churn, a wave of nausea threatening to consume him. Tanjiro felt his heart sink, the weight of his grief and despair threatening to crush him. He had failed to protect her, to save her from the cruel and merciless fate that had claimed her. The guilt and anguish threatened to consume him, leaving him feeling utterly powerless and adrift in this endless abyss of suffering. With each passing day, Tanjiro could feel the last vestiges of his hope slipping away, like grains of sand through his fingers. The once unwavering determination that had fueled his journey now felt like a distant memory, replaced by a creeping sense of resignation and despair. Tanjiro's gaze fell to the floor, his eyes stinging with unshed tears. He had fought so hard, sacrificed so much, only to find himself trapped in this living nightmare, with no clear path to salvation. The weight of his failures threatened to crush him, as he struggled to find the strength to carry on. In the depths of his despair, Tanjiro found himself contemplating the unthinkable, the idea of succumbing to the temptation of oblivion, of escaping this torment through the sweet release of unconsciousness. The pain and anguish were simply too much to bear, and the lure of the void was a siren's call that he found increasingly difficult to resist. Yet, even as the darkness threatened to consume him, a small, flickering flame of hope remained. Tanjiro's fingers traced the familiar outline of Makio's bracelet, a physical connection to the life they had once shared. It was a reminder that, even in the midst of this unimaginable suffering, there had been moments of joy, of love, and of purpose. Tanjiro clung to that memory, his heart aching with the knowledge that those precious moments were now lost to him forever. But he refused to let them slip away entirely, to allow the demons that had taken so much from him to also claim the last vestiges of his humanity. Tanjiro's body had become a mere shell of its former self, ravaged by the relentless torment of captivity. Each day that passed felt like an eternity, as he struggled to maintain any semblance of strength and determination. The constant pacing, the futile attempts to keep his mind and body active, had taken a devastating toll. His limbs felt leaden, his movements sluggish and lethargic. The gnawing hunger that clawed at his stomach had become a merciless tyrant, sapping his strength and dulling his senses. Tanjiro could feel his body betraying him, systems shutting down one by one as it fought a losing battle against the deprivation he had endured. The once vibrant spark within him had been reduced to a faint, flickering ember, threatened by the ever-encroaching darkness. As he lay curled in the corner of his cell, Tanjiro's mind was a maelstrom of conflicting emotions. Despair and hopelessness threatened to consume him, while a stubborn, almost defiant, determination clung to the last vestiges of his consciousness. He knew he had to find a way to escape, to break free from this living nightmare. But with each passing day, the strength and resolve that had once fueled his journey seemed to slip further and further away, like water through cupped hands. Lucky, it was only a few more hours before. Tanjiro's ears picked up as the familiar sound of slow, heavy footsteps approached his cell. He didn't bother to move, his back facing the door as he remained curled on his side, his head resting against the cold, unforgiving wall. The heavy door creaked open, and Tanjiro could feel the presence of his captors looming over him. He refused to acknowledge them, to give them the satisfaction of seeing the despair that plagued his mind. Instead, he focused on the faint sounds of their movements, his senses heightened by the sheer desperation of his situation. Tanjiro knew that he couldn't afford to let his guard down, not even for a moment. These were the demons who had taken so much from him, who had shattered his world and left him trapped in this living hell. And though the very thought of facing them filled him with a deep, primal fear, he refused to let them see the extent of his suffering. As the footsteps drew closer, Tanjiro's heart pounded in his chest, the steady rhythm a defiant call to arms. He may have been broken, battered, and bruised, but he was not yet defeated. There was still a glimmer of hope, a flicker of determination that refused to be extinguished. With a deep, steadying breath, Tanjiro steeled himself for whatever horrors awaited him. He would face his captors with a steely gaze and an unwavering resolve, refusing to surrender even in the face of the most unimaginable torment. For the sake of those he had sworn to protect, he would endure, no matter the cost. Tanjiro's attention was piqued by the soft, rhythmic clicks that echoed against the cold, hard ground of his cell. Though he remained steadfastly facing the wall, his senses were acutely attuned to the presence that had just entered. The silence that followed felt like an eternity, the tension in the air palpable and suffocating. Tanjiro could feel his heart pounding in his chest, the steady rhythm a defiant challenge to the forces that had stripped him of his freedom. Despite his better judgment, Tanjiro risked a glance over his shoulder, his red eyes scanning the dimly lit space. There, on the ground, was a small plate with a sliced peach and a cup of water. The sight of food ignited a primal hunger within him, his stomach growling loudly in response. As Tanjiro began to turn around, his gaze fell upon the figure that stood before him. At first glance, he had assumed it was the Demon King himself, the very embodiment of the evil that had consumed his life. But as he studied the figure more closely, he realized that this was no demon lord. It was a woman, her features strikingly similar to the fearsome creatures that had tormented him. She wore a long, black kimono adorned with golden and orange flowers, the white trim accentuating the elegance of her garment. Her long, ebony hair was tied up with a red ribbon, and golden hair pieces framed her face, drawing attention to her striking red lips and pale skin. Tanjiro couldn't help but wonder if this woman was a sibling or some other relation to the Demon King. The resemblance was uncanny, yet there was a certain softness, a femininity, that set her apart from the brutal, unforgiving nature of the creatures he had encountered. As he studied her, Tanjiro felt a glimmer of confusion and uncertainty. Was she a new tormentor, sent to break his spirit in a different way? Or was there a chance, however slim, that she could be some sort of ally, a potential key to his escape from this living nightmare? Tanjiro's mind raced with questions, his instincts torn between the longing to trust and the overwhelming need to protect himself from further harm. He knew he couldn't afford to let his guard down, not even for a moment. But the allure of the food before him, the promise of sustenance to keep his body and spirit alive, was a siren's call that threatened to lure him into a false sense of security. Tanjiro's mind raced with a whirlwind of questions as he stared at the figure before him. Just moments ago, he had been convinced that this was a woman, a possible glimmer of hope in the darkness that had consumed his world. But now, as the figure spoke, his certainty crumbled, and a deep sense of dread and confusion took root in the pit of his stomach. "Eat, we have places to be," the figure commanded, and Tanjiro's heart sank. That voice, that presence, it was unmistakably Muzan, the Demon King himself. But how could this be? The regal, feminine appearance had thrown him off completely, sowing seeds of doubt and uncertainty in his mind. Tanjiro's red eyes widened with a mixture of fear and bewilderment. What was Muzan playing at? Was this a new tactic, a twisted game designed to break him down even further? The very thought sent shivers down his spine, and he found himself struggling to maintain his composure. As Tanjiro gazed upon Muzan's transformed appearance, he couldn't help but wonder if this was some kind of elaborate illusion. The Demon Lord's typically masculine features had been softened, his face now bearing a striking resemblance to a woman. The long, black kimono and the delicate hair ornaments only served to enhance this feminine allure, leaving Tanjiro utterly perplexed. Was this a new form of torment, a psychological ploy to sow confusion and undermine his resolve? Or was there something more sinister at play, a deeper layer of deception that Tanjiro couldn't even begin to fathom? Tanjiro's mouth opened, the words he had been about to utter dying on his lips as he struggled to make sense of the situation. His mind raced, desperately searching for some explanation, some clue that would shed light on Muzan's true intentions. The silence that hung between them was deafening, the tension palpable as Tanjiro waited, his heart pounding in his chest, for the Demon Lord to reveal his hand. Whatever Muzan had in store for him, Tanjiro knew he couldn't afford to let his guard down. He had to be vigilant, to look for any sign of deception or manipulation, if he was to have even the slightest chance of survival. With a deep, steadying breath, Tanjiro steeled himself, his gaze unwavering as he met Muzan's intense stare. He would not show fear, not this time. He would face whatever twisted game the Demon Lord had in store for him with the same unwavering determination that had carried him through the darkest of times. Tanjiro's eyes lingered on the plate of sliced peaches and the small cup of water, his mouth watering in anticipation. The aroma of the fresh fruit wafted through the air, awakening a primal hunger within him. But as his gaze shifted to Muzan, the Demon King's piercing stare sent a chill down his spine, and Tanjiro hesitated. Muzan's expression darkened, and Tanjiro knew better than to defy him. With a deep, steadying breath, he reached for an peach slice and popped it into his mouth. The cool, crisp texture and the sweet tart flavor exploded on his tongue, and Tanjiro couldn't help but savor it, his eyes closing momentarily as he relished the sensation. As he chewed, the juices ran down his throat, quenching his parched mouth and soothing the dryness that had plagued him. Tanjiro took a sip of the water, the cool liquid a welcome relief to his dehydrated body. He couldn't remember the last time he had tasted such simple, yet nourishing, sustenance. The silence that followed was deafening, the only sound was the soft crunching of Tanjiro's chewing. He determinedly kept his eyes focused on the plate, refusing to meet Muzan's gaze. The very thought of looking at the Demon King's transformed appearance sent shivers down his spine, and Tanjiro knew he couldn't risk losing his composure. Tanjiro's mind raced with questions, his confusion and uncertainty growing with every passing moment. Why was Muzan presenting himself in this way? Was it all an elaborate ruse, a twisted game designed to break him down even further? The possibilities were endless, and Tanjiro found himself grappling with the implications, his heart pounding in his chest. Despite his best efforts to remain calm and focused, Tanjiro couldn't shake the overwhelming sense of dread that had settled in the pit of his stomach. He knew that Muzan was capable of unfathomable cruelty, and the thought of what the Demon Lord had in store for him filled him with a deep, abiding fear. As he swallowed the last bite of the peach, Tanjiro paused, his hand reaching for the cup of water. He couldn't help but wonder if the food and drink were laced with some kind of poison or drag, a means of further subjugating him to Muzan's will. The uncertainty weighed heavily on his mind, and Tanjiro found himself torn between the need for sustenance and the fear of the unknown. Tanjiro's gaze flickered briefly to Muzan's face, only to quickly avert his eyes, the sight of the Demon Lord's transformed appearance too unsettling to bear. He knew he had to be vigilant, to remain on guard against any possible deception or manipulation. Letting his guard down, even for a moment, could prove devastating. With a deep, steadying breath, Tanjiro forced himself to take another sip of the water, his hand trembling slightly. He would need to be strong, to keep his wits about him, if he was to have any chance of surviving whatever horrors Muzan had in store for him. And so, he steeled himself, his resolve hardening as he prepared to face the unknown, one agonizing moment at a time. Tanjiro's heart raced as he watched Muzan swiftly make his way through the wooden door, the Demon King's kimono whirling around his feet. Tanjiro hesitated for a moment, then quickly followed, his footsteps echoing down the dimly lit hallway. As they walked, the sounds of demonic howls and laughter grew louder, sending a chill down Tanjiro's spine. Unable to contain his curiosity, he decided to speak up before they encountered any foul demons. "Why? Why do you look like a woman?" Tanjiro blurted out, his voice betraying a hint of nervousness. Muzan's steps slowed momentarily, and he turned his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "Chaos," he replied, the single word spoken with a level, almost dismissive tone. Tanjiro furrowed his brow, puzzled by the cryptic response, but he knew better than to press the Demon King further. They continued down the corridor, and as they rounded a corner, the plain hallway suddenly opened up into a vast, cavernous space. The room was massive, with towering carved stone walls that seemed to stretch endlessly upwards. The carvings were graphic, depicting demons eating humans or killing them in brutal ways. Tanjiro shuddered and turned to look around even more. In the center, a colossal stone ring had been carved into the floor, its depths reaching down nearly 10 feet. A few demons filled the mostly barren pit, yelling into the crowd. Their crazed shrieks and cheers reverberating off the walls, creating a cacophony of inhuman sounds. Surrounding the central ring, large stone stands lined the walls, providing ample seating for the hordes of demons that had gathered. Tanjiro's eyes widened as he took in the scale and scope of the arena, his heart pounding in his chest. Muzan led Tanjiro towards a dark, wooden raised platform that stood at the edge of the pit. The platform was divided into 3 distinct levels, each one representing a different tier of the demon hierarchy. The lower level housed the lower moons, a few of their eyes fixed upon Tanjiro with a mixture of curiosity and disdain. Tanjiro's mood soared when he saw the demon that was responsible for putting him in this hell hole, Hero, who was creepily smiling at him from the middle of the row. The middle tier was occupied by the upper moons, and Tanjiro's gaze immediately locked onto Akaza, the memory of their previous battle still fresh in his mind. Hate burned within Tanjiro's chest as he recalled the near-fatal encounter that his mentor Kyojuro barely escaped with his life, had it not been for the sun rising. Akaza's golden eyes watched him with interest. Tanjiro was the first one to look away as he started to fall behind the femininely dressed Demon King. The highest level was like a balcony over the lower ranks, the stone pillars holding it up, split between the lower ranks. It looked over the pit so that Muzan could see everything, even his 12 moons. Tanjiro trudged up the spiraling staircase. At the top of the platform stood a beautifully carved wooden pergola, a single, ornately decorated chair at its center. Tanjiro knew without a doubt that this was Muzan's throne, the seat of power for the Demon King himself. As Tanjiro took in the scene, the weight of his situation began to sink in. He was deep within the heart of the demon stronghold, surrounded by some of the most powerful and merciless beings in existence. The realization that he was now at the mercy of Muzan and his inner circle sent a cold shiver through his body, and he steeled himself for whatever horrors were to come. Muzan settled into the ornately carved wooden chair, his regal posture exuding a commanding presence. With a sweeping gesture, he indicated the spot beside his throne. "Sit down," he ordered, his voice brooking no argument. Tanjiro quickly obeyed. He sat down on his knees on the intricately patterned wooden flooring next to the Demon King's seat. As he took his position, he couldn't help but feel painfully aware of his own disheveled appearance in contrast to Muzan's immaculate composure. Tanjiro's clothing was tattered and worn, the once vibrant colors now faded and stained. Gashes and tears marred the fabric, evidence of the harrowing battles he had endured. His shoes were long gone, leaving dirty and ripped socks, a stark contrast to Muzan's pristine, slipper-clad ones. Bruises and cuts mottled Tanjiro's skin, ranging in hue from deep purple to sickly yellow. Angry red gashes stood out in stark relief, a testament to the ferocity of his encounters with the demon world's denizens. Tanjiro felt like a rotten apple next to Muzan's freshly picked perfection, his battered form a stark reminder of the trials he had faced. Muzan's gaze swept over Tanjiro, his expression unreadable. Tanjiro held the Demon King's piercing stare, his heart pounding in his chest, but he refused to back down. The air was thick with tension, the only sound the distant howls and cries of the demons gathered in the vast arena below. Muzan seemed to contemplate the young man beside him, his fingers drumming lightly on the ornate armrest of his throne. Finally, he spoke, his voice smooth and calculated. "You have proven yourself a formidable adversary, Tanjiro Kamado. It is for that reason that I have deigned to grant you this audience." Tanjiro's brow furrowed, his mind racing as he tried to discern Muzan's intentions. The Demon King was notoriously capricious and unpredictable, and Tanjiro knew that he was treading on treacherous ground. Nevertheless, he steeled his resolve, determined to face whatever came next with unwavering courage. The weight of countless demonic gazes bore down on Tanjiro as he knelt beside Muzan's throne. Silence fell over the cavernous arena as the demons noticed their lord had taken his seat. For a fleeting moment, the only sound was the soft creak of the wooden floorboards beneath Tanjiro's aching knees. Muzan raised a languid hand, and with a small gesture, a massive gate at the far end of the arena began to groan and creak open. Tanjiro felt his heart sink as he watched in horror as a procession of humans filed into the pit, their expressions etched with terror and despair. Women clutched children to their chests, their ragged clothing hanging off emaciated frames. Elderly men, their bodies bent and weathered, shuffled forward with trembling steps. The youngest among them appeared no older than 8 or 9, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and bewilderment. As the captives were herded into the center of the arena, the demons erupted into a cacophony of howls and jeers, their hunger for bloodshed palpable. Tanjiro felt bile rise in his throat as he watched the helpless humans being shoved and prodded by the cruel, clawed hands of their demonic captors. He turned to Muzan, his eyes filled with a mixture of revulsion and pleading. Why? Why are these people here? Tanjiro's voice trembled, his heart racing as he struggled to comprehend the horror unfolding before him. Muzan's gaze remained impassive, his fingers drumming lightly on the armrest of his throne. They are my entertainment, he replied, his tone laced with a cruel indifference. Tanjiro's eyes widened in horror as he realized the true nature of this twisted spectacle. These innocent people were mere playthings, pawns in the twisted games of the Demon King and his minions. He felt a surge of righteous fury, his hands clenching into fists as he fought the urge to lash out. The demons below continued to howl and jeer, their bloodlust palpable. Tanjiro could see the terror in the captives' eyes, their faces etched with a desperation that ripped at his heart. He knew he had to do something, to save these people from the horrors that awaited them. But in the face of Muzan's cold, calculating gaze, Tanjiro felt a sense of powerlessness that he had never known before. Muzan made another casual gesture that sent the demons into a frenzy. Their howls and jeers echoed through the cavernous arena as they descended upon the terrified captives. Tanjiro watched in horror as the helpless humans were dragged from the huddled group, their cries of terror and desperation piercing the air. Tanjiro watched as they were torn into with teeth and claws. Blood started to stain the sand below them, guts decorating it in ambiguous gory patterns. Tanjiro jolted up to try and help, though a hand pressed down on his shoulder. He struggled against the hand that pressed down on his shoulder, desperately wanting to intervene, to save these innocent people from the fate that awaited them. But Muzan's iron grip held him in place, forcing Tanjiro to witness the unfolding brutality. More demons from the stand started to fall upon their prey with savage intensity, their claws and fangs tearing into fragile human flesh. Tanjiro winced at the sickening sounds of bones snapping and skin being torn to delicate bleeding ribbons. Blood spattered across the arena floor as the demons indulged their bloodlust, heedless of the anguished pleas of their victims. Tanjiro's heart pounded in his chest as he watched the demons fall upon the captives with savage fury. The sounds of their anguished cries and the sickening thuds of breaking bones sent a shudder through him. Every fiber of his being yearned to rush to their aid, to put a stop to this horrific violence. He strained against the hand that pressed down on his shoulder, desperate to break free and intervene. With gritted teeth, Tanjiro shoved the restraining hand away, only to have both his wrists seized in Muzan's iron grip. The demon lord's eyes bore into him, daring Tanjiro to defy the inevitable. Tanjiro's muscles trembled with the effort to pull his hands free, but Muzan's vice-like hold was unyielding. He felt the panic rising within him, a maelstrom of rage, helplessness, and the sickening realization that he was powerless to stop the carnage unfolding before his eyes. Bile rose in Tanjiro's throat as he watched the demons tear into the captives, their primal brutality leaving no room for mercy or compassion. He strained against Muzan's grasp, his fingers clawing desperately, but the demon lord's grip only tightened, crushing any hope of escape. Tanjiro's chest heaved with ragged breaths, his mind racing to find a way, any way, to break free and save these innocent people. But Muzan's overwhelming presence and the sheer depths of the demons left Tanjiro paralyzed, forced to bear witness to the air was thick with the stench of fear and suffering, and Tanjiro felt his stomach twist with a mixture of revulsion and helplessness. He knew he had to find a way to stop this, to save these people from their cruel fate. But in the face of Muzan's impassive cruelty, Tanjiro felt his resolve wavering, even as his determination burned within him. Tanjiro's heart sank as he watched the demons descend upon the helpless captives, their jaws snapping and claws tearing through flesh with savage brutality. The air was thick with the stench of spilled blood and the agonized screams of their victims, each desperate plea for mercy piercing Tanjiro's very soul. The demons reveled in their carnage, howling and chanting as they feasted upon the dying. Their savage glee echoed through the cavernous chamber, drowning out the cries of the tormented. Tanjiro felt bile rise in his throat, sickened to the core by the sheer callousness of the slaughter. He frantically tried to pull his hands free from Muzan's unyielding grip, every fiber of his being yearning to rush to the captive's aid. But the demon lord's hold was unbreakable, rooting Tanjiro to the spot as he watched the tragedy unfold. "Please, please don't kill them," Tanjiro begged, his voice cracking with anguish. For a moment, Muzan's expression shifted, a flicker of what might have been surprise crossing his features. But the demon lord's face quickly hardened once more, his grip tightening around Tanjiro's wrists. "Why do their lives matter to you, boy?" Muzan's words dripped with disdain, his eyes boring into Tanjiro with utter contempt. "They are but fleeting, insignificant creatures, food for the strong." Tanjiro's heart shattered at the demon's callous dismissal of the captive's humanity. How could Muzan be so devoid of empathy, so indifferent to their suffering? The weight of their impending deaths threatened to crush Tanjiro, his own despair mingling with the anguished cries of the dying. "They are not food," Tanjiro cried, his voice laced with a fury born of sheer desperation. "They are people, innocent lives that deserve to be spared." He strained against Muzan's grip, his fingers clawing at the demon lord's unyielding hands. But Muzan remained unmoved, his cold, dispassionate gaze cutting through Tanjiro like a knife. "Their lives mean nothing to me," the demon lord uttered, his words laced with a chilling finality. "I will allow my children to feast as they please." Tanjiro's heart shattered, the hopelessness of the situation weighing him down like a crushing burden. He had come so far, endured so much, only to be powerless in the face of this unspeakable cruelty. Tears burned at the corners of his eyes as he watched the demons tear into the helpless captives, their savage hunger consuming every last shred of life. The weight of their impending deaths filled Tanjiro with a profound sense of failure and sadness, a heavy ache that threatened to shatter his very being. He had to find a way to stop this, to save these innocent people, but the sheer power of Muzan and his demonic horde left Tanjiro feeling utterly, hopelessly outmatched. Tanjiro felt as though his heart had been ripped from his chest, the agonizing screams of the victims echoing in his mind like the tolling of a funeral bell. He squeezed his eyes shut, desperately trying to block out the horrific scene unfolding before him, but the gruesome sounds and smells were seared into his senses. The air was thick with the stench of spilled blood, the metallic tang invading his nostrils and churning his stomach. The sickening squelch and crunch of flesh being torn apart sent shudders through his body, his mind reeling at the sheer brutality of the demon's onslaught. The boy held his breath, willing himself not to inhale the foul, acrid odor that permeated the chamber. He longed to cover his ears, to shut out the relentless howls and cheers of the demons as they reveled in their carnage. But his hands remained trapped within Muzan's unyielding grasp, a cruel reminder of his powerlessness in the face of this unspeakable horror. Seconds stretched into agonizing minutes as the screams of the victims gradually faded, replaced by an oppressive silence that seemed to smother Tanjiro. He dared not open his eyes, afraid of what new horrors might greet him. Instead, he remained still, every muscle tense, his entire being consumed by a profound sense of utter helplessness. The crowd's raucous chanting continued unabated, their bloodthirsty cries echoing through the cavernous chamber. Tanjiro felt his heart sink, the weight of their inhumanity crushing him, leaving him gasping for air. How could they celebrate such wanton destruction, such senseless loss of life? Tanjiro's resolve threatened to crumble under the sheer magnitude of the tragedy. He had come so far, endured so much, only to be powerless in the face of Muzan's evil. The hopelessness of the situation threatened to consume him, his mind reeling with the knowledge that he had failed to save those innocent people. Tears burned at the corners of his tightly shut eyes, the anguish he felt threatening to overwhelm him. He wanted to scream, to rage against the unfairness of it all, but the words caught in his throat, choked by the suffocating silence that had fallen over the chamber. Tanjiro remained frozen, his body trembling with the effort to hold back the tide of emotions that threatened to engulf him. He knew he had to find the strength to continue, to push forward and find a way to stop Muzan's reign of terror. But in this moment, the weight of the tragedy felt too heavy to bear, the sheer magnitude of the loss leaving him feeling utterly, hopelessly, devastated. Tanjiro felt the crushing grip on his wrists finally release, his eyes snapping open with a mixture of relief and trepidation. As he pulled his sore, reddened wrists back towards his body, he found himself locked in a tense standoff with Muzan, the demon lord regarding him with a small, unsettling smile on his painted red lips. Tanjiro's heart raced as Muzan's hand once again reached out, this time snatching the fabric of his green haori and yanking him forward. The boy stumbled, struggling to maintain his footing as he was dragged closer to the towering figure of the demon lord. Muzan's other hand shot up, large fingers tangling in Tanjiro's hair and wrenching his head back, forcing the boy to meet his eerily calm gaze. "If you truly think their lives are worth something," Muzan hissed, his voice dripping with contempt, "why don't you join them?" Tanjiro's stomach churned with a sickening dread as the full implication of Muzan's words sank in. The demon lord's twisted logic filled him with a profound sense of revulsion, and he instinctively recoiled, his body tensing in anticipation of the horrors to come. But before Tanjiro could even begin to process the sheer magnitude of the threat he faced, Muzan suddenly moved, his imposing figure rising from where he had been looming over the boy. Tanjiro's eyes widened in alarm as the demon lord's hand tightened his hold, tangling in the thick locks of his hair and yanking him forward. Tanjiro had no choice but to stumble along, his scalp burning with the force of Muzan's relentless grip. The demon lord dragged him towards the edge of the platform, Tanjiro's heart pounding in his chest as he realized the horrifying intent behind Muzan's actions. As they reached the precipice, Muzan suddenly halted, pulling Tanjiro's upper body forward over the edge. The boy's stomach dropped as he found himself suspended precariously, the only thing anchoring him to safety being the iron grip on his hair. Tanjiro's fingers scrabbled at the edge of the platform, his mind racing as he desperately sought a way to pull himself back to safety. But Muzan's cruel gaze bore down upon him, and Tanjiro knew that the demon lord had no intention of keeping him from the fate that awaited below. With a sudden, savage jerk, Muzan released his hold on Tanjiro's hair, sending the boy hurtling into the blood-stained pit below. Tanjiro's stomach lurched as he fell, the world around him a blur of sand and shadows. The air rushed past him, the distance to the ground seeming to stretch on for an eternity. Tanjiro braced himself for the inevitable impact, his body tensing as he awaited the sickening crunch of bones and the blinding pain that would surely follow. But even as he plummeted, a spark of determination flickered to life within him. He had come too far, endured too much, to give up now. With a renewed sense of purpose, Tanjiro steeled his resolve, determined to find a way to survive and continue his fight against Muzan and the demons. Just as he reached the bottom of the pit, a familiar face flashed before his eyes, filling him with a surge of hope and renewed determination. He may have been thrown into the depths of this nightmare, but he was not alone, and he would do whatever it took to make it out alive. Time seemed to slow to a crawl as Tanjiro felt himself falling, his vision filled with the sight of the blood-stained sandy pit below. The agonizing screams of the victim still echoed in his mind, and Tanjiro knew with a growing sense of despair that he was about to share their fate. The air rushed past him, the distance to the ground seeming to stretch on for an eternity. Tanjiro braced himself for the inevitable impact, his body tensing as he waited for the pain that would surely follow. Tanjiro hit the ground hard, the impact driving the breath from his lungs and sending a jolt of pain through his body. For a moment, he lay there, stunned and disoriented, struggling to regain his bearings. But the stillness was quickly shattered as Tanjiro became acutely aware of the demonic presences surrounding him. Clawed, hoofed, and decidedly inhuman hands began to reach for him, grasping and clawing at his flesh. Tanjiro thrashed and struggled, fighting with every ounce of his remaining strength. He slammed an elbow hard into the stomach of one of the demons, causing it to double over, clutching its midsection. Seizing the opportunity, Tanjiro launched himself through the gap, putting as much distance between himself and the horde of demons as he could manage. Finally, Tanjiro paused, looking up towards the towering figure of Muzan, his gaze burning with a deadly intensity. Tanjiro's blood ran cold as Muzan's chilling words echoed through the arena. The demon lord's gaze was fixed upon him, a twisted smirk playing on his red lips. "You see, my dear Tanjiro," Muzan purred, his voice dripping with malice. "I have plans for you. And I can't very well carry them out if you're broken beyond repair." Tanjiro's stomach churned with a sickening dread as the full implication of Muzan's words sank in. The demon lord's twisted logic filled him with a profound sense of revulsion, and he instinctively recoiled, his body tensing in anticipation of the horrors to come. "So do try to stay alive, won't you?" Muzan continued, his tone almost conversational. "I'd hate for my entertainment to be cut short." With a dismissive flick of his wrist, the demon lord signaled to the horde of demons lurking in the shadows, their eyes gleaming with savage hunger. "Have your fun, my pets," Muzan purred. "But remember, I need him intact." The demons surged forward, their claws and fangs gleaming in the flickering torchlight. Tanjiro knew he had to run, to fight, to do whatever it took to survive. But the weight of Muzan's words hung heavy in the air, a constant reminder of the unspeakable horrors that awaited him. Tanjiro let out a string of colorful curses, his frustration and fear palpable. But with Muzan's permission, the demons below were now utterly ruthless in their pursuit. Tanjiro knew he had to keep moving, to find a way to survive this nightmare and continue his fight against the demon lord and his minions. Gritting his teeth, Tanjiro took off again, his lungs burning and his body aching, but his determination unwavering. He would not give up, not now, not ever. This was a fight he had to win, for the sake of all those he had sworn to protect. Tanjiro's heart raced as he frantically dodged and weaved through the horde of demons, his senses on high alert. The air was thick with the stench of blood and decay, and the ground beneath his feet was slick with the remains of those who had fallen before him. As the demons lunged and swiped at him with their razor-sharp claws, Tanjiro found himself relying on his quick reflexes and nimble movements to avoid their grasp. He ducked under outstretched hands, twisting and turning with a grace born of sheer desperation. In a moment of desperation, Tanjiro grabbed a handful of sand and flung it into the faces of his attackers, momentarily blinding them. The small dust clouds provided just enough cover for him to slip away, his feet pounding against the uneven ground. But as Tanjiro's foot suddenly slid out from under him, he realized with a sinking feeling that he had stepped on something far more sinister than mere dirt. Glancing down, he felt a wave of horror wash over him as he recognized the glistening, pulpy mass beneath his foot, the remains of a fallen victim. Tanjiro's stomach churned, and for a moment, he was paralyzed by the sheer brutality of the scene before him. He was standing in the center of the arena, surrounded by the mutilated bodies of those who had come before him, their lifeless eyes staring up at him in mute accusation. The demons, sensing his momentary hesitation, surged forward once more, their screeching cries echoing through the cavernous space. Tanjiro knew he had to keep moving, to find a way to survive this nightmare, but the weight of the carnage around him threatened to crush his resolve. Gritting his teeth, Tanjiro forced himself to push forward, his feet slipping and sliding over the grisly terrain. He had to escape, had to find a way to stop Muzan and the demons once and for all. Failure was not an option, not when so much was at stake. Tanjiro's feet squelched through the thick, crimson-stained sand as he desperately fought his way forward. The once pristine white of his socks was now a mottled, rust-colored mess, the fabric clinging to his skin as he navigated the treacherous terrain. Ducking and weaving, Tanjiro used every ounce of his agility to evade the grasping hands of the demons that surrounded him. But just as he dodged one set of claws, another would reach out, snagging the back of his collar and yanking him backward. Tanjiro reacted in an instant, arching his back and aiming a fierce punch straight at the demon's nose. The creature howled in pain, its grip momentarily loosening, and Tanjiro seized the opportunity to wrench himself free. But the reprieve was short-lived, as more demons surged forward, their claws and fangs gleaming in the flickering torchlight. Tanjiro felt the sharp sting of their attacks, hissing in pain as they tore at his flesh, leaving ragged gashes in their wake. Amidst the chaos, something caught Tanjiro's eye, a glint of metal that stood out against the sea of carnage. Focusing his senses, he caught the faint, familiar scent of Nichiren, the alloy used to forge demon-slaying swords. It was in the hands of a red-skinned demon who stood on the edges of the fight, yelling and shouting in glee. Without hesitation, Tanjiro began to fight his way towards the source of the scent, his movements becoming more desperate and ruthless as he closed in on his target. The demons, sensing his newfound determination, redoubled their efforts to stop him, but Tanjiro was driven by a singular purpose. As he neared the glittering sword, Tanjiro's heart raced with a mixture of hope and dread. This could be the key to turning the tide of the battle, but he knew all too well the horrors that had befallen the previous owner. With a deep breath, he steeled his resolve and reached for the weapon, his fingers closing around the familiar hilt. Tanjiro's fingers had barely grazed the hilt of the gleaming Nichiren sword when the demon let out a guttural roar and yanked the weapon out of his reach. In one swift motion, the creature brought the sword slashing down towards Tanjiro's head, its eyes burning with malicious intent. Tanjiro's heart pounded in his chest as he narrowly dodged the attack, feeling the swish of wind as the blade crept perilously close to his face. Without hesitation, he launched himself at the demon, ramming his shoulder into the smaller creature's torso and sending them both tumbling to the ground in a tangle of limbs. As the demon's grip on the sword slackened, Tanjiro reacted with the speed of a fleeing rodent, his fingers closing around the familiar hilt just as the demon tried to pull it away. Adrenaline coursing through his veins, Tanjiro shifted into a fighting stance, the weight of the sword feeling almost foreign in his hands. But as he steadied himself, Tanjiro recognized the balance and heft of the blade. It was a dual sword, its twin lost to the ravages of battle. Without a moment's pause, he launched into the third form of the water-breathing technique, flowing dance, his movements fluid and graceful as a tidal wave of water erupted from the sword. The sudden shift in the flow of energy caused water droplets to pelt Tanjiro's face, but he ignored the sharp cold sensation, his focus laser-sharp as he charged into the fray. The Nichiren sword sang through the air, its razor-sharp edge slicing effortlessly through the demonic flesh, dark blood splattering onto Tanjiro's clothes and skin. Tanjiro moved with a ferocity he had never known, his limbs a blur as he danced through the horde of demons, his sword a deadly extension of his body. Each strike was measured and precise, every movement calculated to maximize the blade's devastating power. As the demons fell one by one, Tanjiro's confidence grew, his resolve hardening with each hard-won victory. He knew that the path ahead would only grow more treacherous, but with the weight of the sword in his hand and the spirits of his fallen comrades guiding him, he was determined to push forward, no matter the cost. Tanjiro's sword danced through the air, the gleaming Nichiren blade slicing effortlessly through the demonic flesh. Dark blood sprayed across his face and clothing as he moved with a fluid grace, his feet light and nimble as he navigated the chaotic battlefield. But just as the young demon slayer began to gain the upper hand, the demons unleashed a terrifying array of blood-fueled abilities. One creature let out a bone-rattling roar, the ground shuddering beneath their feet as a powerful tremor swept through the area. Tanjiro struggled to maintain his footing as the earth rolled and heaved, his balance faltering with each thunderous vibration. Just then, another demon raised its clawed hand, and with a malevolent grin, sent a whirlwind of red-stained sand swirling through the air. Tanjiro's eyes widened as the swirling vortex of debris hurtled towards him, the sharp grains pelting his exposed skin and stinging his eyes. Gritting his teeth, Tanjiro ducked and weaved, his sword flashing as he tried to cut through the relentless winds. But the demon's blood art was relentless, the miniature tornado driving him back and disrupting his movements. Tanjiro could feel his balance slipping, the tremors and the stinging sand making it increasingly difficult to maintain his footing and his fighting stance. Desperate to regain the upper hand, Tanjiro dug deep, drawing upon the teachings of the water-breathing technique. He shifted his weight, his movements becoming more fluid and adaptable, like water flowing around obstacles. With each strike of his sword, he channeled the power of the element, using the momentum of the whirlwind to fuel his own attacks. As Tanjiro's confidence grew, so too did the ferocity of his strikes. He slashed and parried, his sword a blur as he cut through the demonic onslaught. The demons, sensing his newfound determination, redoubled their efforts, their BLD arts becoming more intense and concentrated. The battlefield erupted into pure chaos as the demons unleashed a relentless barrage of devastating BLD arts. Tanjiro's muscles tensed, his grip tightening on the hilt of his sword as he braced for the onslaught. One demon conjured searing ball of flame, the fiery projectiles hurtling through the air with blinding speed. Tanjiro's eyes narrowed in concentration as he twisted and pivoted, his body a blur as he dodged the scorching attacks. The heat seared his skin, but he refused to be deterred, his sword at the ready. Tanjiro's sword was a blur of motion as he slashed and hacked his way through the horde of demons, his muscles straining with each powerful swing. The thin blade bit into their flesh, cleaving through sinew and bone with a sickening crunch. In the chaos of the battle, Tanjiro would sometimes get lucky, managing to land a clean, precise strike that severed the demon's head from its body. The decapitated corpses disintegrated into a fine ash, the particles mingling with the swirling sand that filled the air, creating a dense, choking haze that obscured Tanjiro's vision. He coughed and blinked, his eyes stinging from the gritty, abrasive particles that assaulted them. But he refused to let the diminished visibility slow him down, his senses heightened to compensate for the lack of clear sight. He relied on his keen hearing and the subtle shifts in the air currents to detect the demon's movements, his blade flashing in the dimness as he struck with unerring precision. The sound of cracking bones and the agonized shrieks of the demons filled the air, a symphony of violence that threatened to overwhelm Tanjiro's senses. But he remained focused, his mind clear and his resolve unwavering. He knew that he could not afford to falter, not when the fate of the world hung in the balance. Each time his sword found its mark, Tanjiro felt a surge of grim satisfaction, tempered by the heavy weight of the lives he had taken. He knew that every demon he destroyed was one less that would wreak havoc upon the innocent, but the toll it took on his own soul was immense. Still, he pressed on, driven by an unyielding determination to put an end to Muzan's reign of terror. The ash and sand continued to swirl around him, coating his skin and hair, stinging his eyes and throat. But Tanjiro refused to let it slow him down, his movements fluid and graceful as he danced through the horde of demons, his sword a deadly extension of his own body. Time seemed to slow to a crawl as Tanjiro lost himself in the rhythm of the battle, his senses hyper-focused on the slightest shift in the air, the faintest sound of a demon's approach. He was a force of nature, a whirlwind of destruction that cut a swath through the demonic ranks, his resolve hardening with each life he claimed. Just as he regained his footing on the shifting sands, another demon let out a piercing, mind-numbing screech. Tanjiro's vision swam, his ears ringing with the shrill, unnatural sound. To his horror, he watched as the scream summoned a swarm of razor-sharp hornets, the buzzing insects descending upon him in a cloud of venomous stings. Tanjiro hissed in pain as the hornets' barbed stingers pierced his flesh, the venom coursing through his veins and clouding his senses. He swung his sword wildly, trying to fend off the relentless swarm, but the uncoordinated attacks only left him more vulnerable. Just when he thought he couldn't withstand any more, a powerful whirlwind struck him, the tunnel-like swirling winds knocking him off balance and battering his battered body. Tanjiro grunted in frustration as the hornets were swept away, but the onslaught of different attacks was becoming too much for him to handle. He staggered, his vision blurring as he struggled to regain his footing. The demon's BLD arts were in perfect harmony, each attack complementing the others and leaving him utterly overwhelmed. Tanjiro's mind raced, desperately searching for a way to turn the tide of the battle. The relentless onslaught of demonic attacks weighed heavily on Tanjiro's body, his muscles straining with the effort to keep up with the ever-changing patterns of their BLD arts. The howling winds and sand whipped at his face, stinging his eyes and making it increasingly difficult to maintain his focus. Gritting his teeth, Tanjiro knew he needed to turn the tide of the battle in his favor. Summoning every ounce of his training in DSPLN, he began to shift his stance, his movements becoming sharper and more precise. Steam erupted from his sword and mouth as he transitioned into Hinakami Kagura, the ancient dance of his family. Tanjiro's eyes narrowed with concentration, his body flowing through the intricate forms with a grace and fluidity that belied the sheer power he was about to unleash. With a deep, steadying breath, Tanjiro moved his sword forward, a billowing plume of flames erupting from the blade. The scorching heat seared the air, the sand that blew around him turning to shimmering glass as the flames tore through the demonic onslaught, the smell of burning flesh filling the air around them. To Tanjiro, the flames felt like a warm embrace, a familiar power that he could wield with unwavering control. The roaring fire consumed the demons, their anguished howls echoing through the chaos. Yet, Tanjiro never faltered, his sword a blur as he danced through the battlefield, the flames caressing his skin like the gentle licks of a loyal dog greeting its owner. He had spent countless hours training with Kaijuro, honing his mastery of sun breathing. Though the technique still took a heavy toll on his body, Tanjiro had become more adept at slipping into its rhythms, his movements becoming more fluid and efficient with each passing battle. Still, he dared not push himself too far, knowing that the path ahead would only grow more treacherous. The demons, sensing his newfound power, redoubled their efforts, their BLD arts becoming more intense and focused. Tanjiro's muscles burned with exertion, his lungs heaving as he fought to keep up with the relentless onslaught. But he refused to falter, his sword a blur as he danced through the chaos, the weight of the blade in his hand and the spirits of his fallen comrades guiding his every strike. With each passing moment, Tanjiro's confidence grew, his movements becoming more assured and his attacks more devastating. The demon's BLD arts, once a seemingly impenetrable wall of destruction, began to crumble under the onslaught of his flame-breathing. Yet, Tanjiro knew that he could not afford to let his guard down. The battle was far from over, and he would need to summon every ounce of his strength and determination to emerge victorious. With a renewed sense of purpose, he steeled himself, his eyes alight with the determination to protect the innocent and vanquish the demonic forces that threatened to engulf the land. Tanjiro's muscles tensed as he brought his sword down in a swift, decisive arc, aiming to cleave through the demon's head with a single, powerful strike. But just as the blade was about to connect, he was suddenly rammed in the side by a tremendous force, causing his body to lurch violently to the side. A loud, sickening snap echoed through the air as Tanjiro's sword shattered, the shards flying in all directions. Tanjiro was sent hurtling to the ground, his body skidding across the unforgiving terrain for several agonizing feet before he finally came to a stop, his senses reeling from the impact. Gritting his teeth against the pain, Tanjiro struggled to regain his footing, his eyes darting around the battlefield as he tried to assess the situation. But it was already too late, the demons had seized upon his moment of vulnerability, and they were now launching a relentless barrage of attacks, their demonic BLD arts raining down upon him from all sides. Tanjiro hissed in pain as a searing fireball grazed his arm, burning through the fabric of his precious Haori. He ducked and weaved, dodging a volley of compact mud ball that slammed into his back with dull, heavy thuds, throwing him off balance. Swearing under his breath, Tanjiro realized that he had been so accustomed to fighting with his heavier, single-edged sword that he had failed to adjust his strikes for the much thinner, lighter dual blades he now wielded. The demons were exploiting this weakness mercilessly, overwhelming him with a relentless onslaught of attacks that he was struggling to keep up with. Tanjiro's heart pounded in his chest as he scrambled to evade the relentless onslaught of demonic attacks. His body moved with the desperate, frantic energy of a cornered animal, his feet barely touching the ground as he ducked, weaved, and dodged, his sole focus on staying alive. The demons, sensing his vulnerability, began to grow bolder, some of them breaking away from the pack to engage him in one-on-one combat. Tanjiro knew that he couldn't afford to be caught in close quarters with these monstrosities, their razor-sharp claws and teeth could easily rip him to shreds. With lightning-fast reflexes, Tanjiro danced and twirled, his haori a blur of green and black. He knew that he couldn't keep up this frantic pace forever, but the alternative was unthinkable. He had to find a way to turn the tide of the battle, to seize the initiative and regain control. Tanjiro's knuckles turned white as he tightened his grip on the hilt of his sword, the small jagged stump of the blade a stark reminder of the trials he had endured. Despite the weapon's limitations, he knew that he would have to get in close to effectively behead any demons he encountered. It was a daunting task, to be sure, but Tanjiro had faced such challenges before and emerged victorious. His eyes narrowed with steely determination as he surveyed the battlefield, his senses heightened and his body poised to spring into action at a moment's notice. As he darted and dashed, one of the demons managed to latch onto his wrist, yanking him back towards its gaping maw. Tanjiro's eyes widened in terror, his mind racing as he frantically sought a way to break free. In a sudden, desperate act, Tanjiro took a deep breath, steeled his nerves, and slammed his forehead into the demon's face with a loud, sickening crack. The demon reeled back, its grip loosening just enough for Tanjiro to wrench his arm free. Tanjiro staggered for a moment, his vision swimming and his head pounding from the impact. But he had managed to catch the demon off guard, and as it crumpled to its knees, unconscious, Tanjiro felt a surge of grim satisfaction. He knew that his hard-headed gamble had been a risky one, but in the heat of battle, sometimes desperate measures were the only way to survive. Tanjiro took a moment to catch his breath, his eyes scanning the battlefield as he prepared for the next wave of demonic assaults. The air was thick with the stench of blood and burning flesh, the sounds of the demon's unearthly howls and the clashing of steel echoing all around him. Tanjiro's mind raced as he desperately sought a way to turn the tide of the battle in his favor. The relentless onslaught of demons was wearing him down, and he knew that he couldn't keep up this frantic pace of evasion and defense for much longer. Suddenly, an idea struck him, a glimmer of hope in the midst of the chaos. What if he could somehow set the demons against each other, pitting them in a murderous free-for-all that would take the pressure off of him? It was a risky gamble, but Tanjiro knew that he had little choice. His survival depended on finding a way to disrupt the demons' coordination and unity. And so, with a determined set to his jaw, he launched himself towards one of the more powerful-looking demons, the one that had been unleashing devastating fireballs upon the battlefield. Tanjiro's muscles strained and burned as he pushed his body to its limits, his feet pounding against the scorched earth as he closed the distance. The demon, sensing his approach, opened its maw and unleashed another searing blast of flame. But Tanjiro was ready. With a burst of speed, he shifted his body to the side, the fireball blazing past him and striking another unsuspecting demon. The targeted creature let out a horrific, agonized scream as the flames seared its flesh, the acrid stench of burning skin filling the air. Tanjiro couldn't help but smile grimly as he watched the two demons turn on each other, their original unity and cohesion shattered by the unexpected attack. The demon that had unleashed the fireball was now frantically trying to fend off the crazed, burning demon, its claws and fangs lashing out in a desperate bid for survival. The chaos that Tanjiro had sown was exactly what he needed. With the demons now distracted and focused on their own internecine struggle, he had a brief respite, a chance to catch his breath and regroup before the next wave of attacks. Tanjiro's heart pounded in his chest, adrenaline coursing through his veins as he watched the two demons tear into each other. He knew that this was only a temporary reprieve, but he was determined to make the most of it. His eyes darted around the battlefield, searching for any other opportunities he could exploit to further disrupt the demons' unity and cohesion. The sounds of the demons' roars and the crackle of the flames filled the air, a discordant symphony of violence that threatened to overwhelm Tanjiro's senses. But he remained focused, his mind clear and his resolve unbreakable. He had come too far to falter now, and he would do whatever it took to ensure his own survival and, ultimately, the salvation of the world. The din of the bloodthirsty crowd was deafening, their raucous cheers and jeers echoing through the cavernous arena like the howls of a pack of hyenas. Tanjiro couldn't help but feel a chill run down his spine as he surveyed the sea of twisted, hungry faces that surrounded him, their eyes gleaming with a perverse excitement at the carnage unfolding before them. The demons, once united in their relentless assault on the beleaguered young warrior, had now descended into a chaotic free-for-all, their animalistic instincts taking over as they turned on one another. The demon that had been raining down devastating fireballs was now desperately fending off the crazed, burning creature it had inadvertently struck, its claws and fangs slashing and rending in a frenzied bid for survival. But the respite was short-lived, as some of the other demons, sensing an opportunity to gain the upper hand, began to converge on the two combatants, intent on pulling them apart and regaining control of the situation. Tanjiro's heart pounded in his chest as he watched the scene unfold, his mind racing to process the rapidly shifting dynamics of the battle. He knew that he couldn't afford to let his guard down, even for a moment. The demons were relentless and merciless, and any lapse in concentration could prove to be his undoing. The crowd's bloodlust only seemed to intensify as the demons began to tear into one another, their roars and screeches mingling with the shrieks of the injured and the triumphant howls of the victors. Tanjiro felt bile rising in his throat as he witnessed the sheer brutality and savagery of the demons' actions, their claws and fangs ripping and tearing with reckless abandon. Yet, even amidst the chaos, Tanjiro couldn't help but feel a glimmer of hope. If he could continue to sow discord and disarray among the demons, perhaps he could find a way to turn the tide of the battle in his favor. But he knew that he would have to be quick and decisive, for the demons' unity and coordination were already beginning to reassert themselves. Tanjiro tensed his muscles, his grip tightening on his sword as he scanned the battlefield, searching for any other opportunities he could exploit. The roar of the crowd pounded in his ears, a cacophony of bloodlust and excitement that threatened to overwhelm his senses. But he refused to be cowed, his determination only hardening in the face of the mounting danger. This was a battle he couldn't afford to lose, not with so much at stake. And so, with a deep breath, he steeled himself for the next wave of demonic attacks, ready to do whatever it took to ensure his own survival and, ultimately, the salvation of the world. Tanjiro's eyes narrowed as he turned to face Muzan, the demon lord who had orchestrated this entire nightmarish scenario. Despite the chaos and carnage unfolding around him, he couldn't help but feel a surge of defiance and determination coursing through his veins. Muzan's gaze was fixed upon him, his feminine features contorted into a slight expression of surprise and begrudging respect. Tanjiro could see the calculating gleam in the demon's eyes, as if he was re-evaluating the young warrior's capabilities and potential threat. The crowd's raucous cheers and jeers had died down to a hush, as if they too were transfixed by the silent standoff between the two adversaries. The air was thick with tension, the only sounds the roars and snarls of the demons as they continued to tear each other apart in the pit below. Tanjiro's hands balled into fist around the sword's handle, his knuckles turning white with the intensity of his grip. He knew that Muzan was a formidable opponent, a creature of immense power and cunning that had eluded capture for centuries. And yet, in this moment, he felt a surge of conviction and resolve that he had never experienced before. Muzan's gaze flickered down to the chaos unfolding in the pit, a slight smirk playing at the corners of his lips. "Impressive," he murmured, his voice low and silky, "I didn't expect you to have the presence of mind to turn my own minions against one another." Tanjiro's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing as he refused to be cowed by the demon lord's condescending tone. "I'll do whatever it takes to survive and stop you," he replied, his voice steady and unwavering. Muzan's lips curled into a sardonic smile, his cold, calculating gaze boring into Tanjiro's. "How amusing, the little human thinks he can defy me," he drawled, his tone dripping with disdain. "You are nothing but an insect, scurrying about, thinking you can make a difference. Your pathetic attempts at heroism will only lead to your demise." Tanjiro felt a surge of defiance rise within him, his grip on his sword tightening. "I may be just a human, but I've faced demons like you before, and I've emerged victorious," he retorted, his voice laced with a steely determination. "Your arrogance will be your downfall, Muzan. I won't rest until you and your demon horde are destroyed." The demon lord's eyes narrowed, a flicker of annoyance crossing his features. "Bold words, for one so powerless," he hissed, his fingers curling into talons. "You have no idea the true extent of my power, the depths of my cruelty. I will crush you and everything you hold dear, and there is nothing you can do to stop me." Tanjiro refused to be cowed, his eyes burning with a fierce resolve. "We'll see about that," he shot back, his voice laced with a confidence that belied the pounding of his heart. "I won't give up, no matter what you throw at me. I'll keep fighting, because I have people I need to protect, people who are counting on me to prevail." Muzan's lips twisted into a cruel smirk, his gaze darkening with malice. "Then you will die a fool's death, Tanjiro Kamado," he declared, his voice dripping with malevolence. "And I will savor every moment of your demise." The tension in the air was palpable, the weight of their unspoken confrontation pressing down upon Tanjiro like a physical force. He knew that he was facing an enemy unlike any he had ever encountered before, a creature of pure evil and unimaginable power. Muzan's gaze narrowed as he fixed his piercing stare upon the young demon slayer, Tanjiro Kamado. The demon lord's lips curled into a cruel sneer, his eyes burning with malevolence. "Kaigaku," he commanded, his voice dripping with disdain, "take care of this." The lower moon, Kaigaku, immediately sprung into action, his powerful frame effortlessly clearing the distance between the platform and the chaotic arena below. As he landed, the ground shook with the force of his impact, sending tremors through the surrounding area. Tanjiro couldn't help but be struck by the sheer physicality of the demon before him. Kaigaku was a muscular, youthful-looking figure, his silky black hair framing a face that was currently twisted into a menacing snarl. The young demon slayer's eyes were drawn to the demon's unique features, his dark turquoise irises, the unsettling black sclera, and the single, etched, one within each of his pupils, a clear indication of his formidable rank among the demon hierarchy. Tanjiro's gaze was then drawn to the flame-like markings on Kaigaku's cheeks, the patterns seeming to accentuate the demon's already intimidating appearance. The boy couldn't help but notice the sharp, fanged teeth that protruded from the demon's mouth, a clear sign of his monstrous nature. Kaigaku's ears, pointed and elf-like, added to the otherworldly, inhuman quality of his features. The young demon slayer's eyes trailed down, taking in the demon's attire, a sleek, black kimono, the fabric accented with intricate white patterns, and a loose, blue belt that dangled from his waist, lending an air of elegance to the otherwise primal and predatory being before him. As Kaigaku advanced, Tanjiro could feel the tension in the air, the demon's every step exuding a sense of power and grace that belied his monstrous nature. The young demon slayer knew that he was facing an opponent of unimaginable strength and cunning, one who would not hesitate to tear him apart without a moment's hesitation. Tanjiro tensed his muscles, dropping into a low fighting stance as he gripped the hilt of the jagged, broken sword. His keen, crimson eyes were fixated on the figure of Kaigaku, the young demon who now stood before him. Kaigaku reached up and pulled a sword from his back, the blade gleaming with a vibrant yellow hue, accented by intricate black lightning-like patterns that ran along one side of the dark edge. Tanjiro's eyes narrowed as he recognized the weapon. It was almost an exact replica of Zenitsu's sword, save for the inverted color scheme. Tanjiro remembered Zenitsu recounting his training under the tutelage of the legendary swordsman, Jigoro Kawajima. Zenitsu had mentioned another student who had trained alongside him, but he had never revealed the name of this fellow disciple. As small sparks of black lightning began to crackle and build around the blade, Tanjiro felt a surge of realization. "You trained alongside Zenitsu, didn't you?" he hissed, his voice laced with a mixture of accusation and surprise. Kaigaku's eyes widened momentarily, betraying his initial shock at Tanjiro's deduction. But the demon quickly steeled his features, his lips curling into a sneer as he leveled his sword at Tanjiro. "Shut up," Kaigaku spat, his voice dripping with disdain. You have no idea what you're talking about, human. Tanjiro could feel the tension in the air thickening as the two adversaries faced off, their auras clashing like opposing forces. He knew that Kaigaku was no ordinary opponent. The young demon had clearly honed his skills under the tutelage of the same MSTR as Zenitsu, and the power crackling around his sword was a testament to his formidable abilities. But Tanjiro was no stranger to daunting challenges. He had faced countless demons, each one more powerful than the last, and he had emerged victorious time and time again. His grip on the sword's hilt tightened as he prepared to meet Kaigaku's assault head-on. "I may not know the full story," Tanjiro said, his voice calm and steady, "but I do know that you've chosen to walk a dark path, one that has led you to serve the very demons we're sworn to destroy. That's a choice I can never condone, no matter how skilled you may be." Kaigaku's eyes narrowed, the black scara and turquoise irises lending an unsettling, inhuman quality to his gaze. "You speak of choices as if you understand anything about the sacrifices I've had to make," he hissed, the electricity crackling around his sword intensifying with his rising anger. "You're just a pathetic human, clinging to your precious ideals and your foolish sense of justice. You have no idea what it's like to be a demon, to have the power to change the world at your fingertips." Tanjiro's expression hardened, his jaw set with determination. "Maybe I don't know the full extent of your struggles," he acknowledged, "but I do know that serving Muzan and terrorizing innocent people is never the answer. There is always another way, a path that doesn't involve hurting others." The tension in the air was palpable as the two adversaries stared each other down, their auras clashing like opposing forces. Tanjiro knew that this battle would be a true test of his skill and resolve, but he was more than ready to face the challenge head-on. "I won't back down, Kaigaku," he said, his voice unwavering. "I'll fight to protect the people I love, no matter the cost. And I'll do whatever it takes to bring you and the moons down to the pits of hell." Kaigaku's eyes narrowed, the turquoise irises glinting with malice. With a guttural yell, he lunged forward, his sword raised high as he brought it down in a powerful strike aimed at Tanjiro. Tanjiro quickly raised the broken sword in his hands, bracing himself as the two blades met with a resounding clash. The impact sent sparks flying in all directions, and Tanjiro felt a jolt of electricity travel up the hilt and into his hand, making him wince slightly. The black lightning crackling around Kaigaku's sword seemed to have a life of its own, the ethereal energy lashing out like striking serpents. Tanjiro gritted his teeth, feeling the raw power of the demon's weapon as it pushed against his own. "You can't hope to match my strength, human," Kaigaku hissed, his face contorted in a snarl. "I've honed my skills under the same MSTR as Zenitsu. You're no match for me." Tanjiro's eyes narrowed, determination burning within them. "That may be true," he acknowledged, "but I won't give up without a fight." With a surge of strength, he pushed back against Kaigaku's assault, their blades scraping and sending more sparks into the air. The two adversaries engaged in a fierce exchange of blows, their swords clashing in a deadly dance. Tanjiro could feel the electricity coursing through Kaigaku's weapon, the power of the demon's abilities making his own sword vibrate with the impact of each strike. As the battle raged on, Tanjiro could see the sheer intensity in Kaigaku's eyes, the young demon's thirst for power and his willingness to serve the demon lord Muzan. It was a stark contrast to the way Zenitsu had described his fellow disciple, and Tanjiro couldn't help but wonder what had driven Kaigaku down such a dark path. But there was no time to dwell on the past. Tanjiro knew he had to focus solely on the present, on the fight at hand. He needed to find a way to overcome Kaigaku's formidable abilities and stop him from serving the demons they had sworn to destroy. With renewed determination, Tanjiro pushed back against Kaigaku's assault, his movements swift and precise as he sought to find an opening in the demons' defenses. The air crackled with the energy of their clash, the sound of steel against steel echoing through the air. Tanjiro knew that this battle would be a true test of his skill and resolve, but he was more than ready to face the challenge head-on. He would fight to protect the people he loved, no matter the cost, and he would do whatever it took to bring Kaigaku and the other demons who served Muzan to justice. The air crackled with tension as Tanjiro and Kaigaku faced off, the broken sword in Tanjiro's hands the only thing standing between him and the demon's relentless onslaught. Kaigaku let out a guttural roar, his black lightning-infused sword slicing through the air as he launched himself at Tanjiro. Tanjiro knew he needed to stay close, his shorter-range weapon putting him at a disadvantage against the demon's longer blade. As the swords clashed, Tanjiro felt the electricity coursing through Kaigaku's weapon travel up the hilt and into his own hands. He hissed in pain as the current made his muscles spasm, but he refused to let it deter him. Tanjiro's feet danced across the ground, his movements quick and nimble as he parried Kaigaku's strikes. The two combatants were locked in a deadly dance, their blades singing as they sliced through the air, sending sparks flying in all directions. Determined to gain the upper hand, Tanjiro shifted into a fire-breathing technique, the flames liking at the edges of his sword. The dance of fire and lightning was a mesmerizing sight, the two opposing elements intertwining in a macabre tango of light and power. Kaigaku's eyes widened as he witnessed the display, the intensity of Tanjiro's resolve clearly taking him by surprise. But the demon refused to be outmatched, his own attacks becoming more ferocious as he sought to overwhelm the young demon slayer. Tanjiro gritted his teeth, feeling the strain of the prolonged battle. His arms ached from the constant parrying, and the electricity coursing through his body was draining his stamina. But he knew he couldn't afford to let up, not when the lives of innocent people hung in the balance. It was a deadly dance of clashing blades and singing sparks, letting the flames dance with the lighting in a blazing tango of bleeding flames. With a renewed burst of determination, Tanjiro pushed back against Kaigaku's assault, his movements becoming more fluid and precise. He knew he had to find a way to break through the demon's defenses and land a decisive blow, but the task seemed daunting as Kaigaku's speed and power continued to overwhelm him. The clash of steel and the crackle of lightning echoed through the air, the two adversaries locked in a deadly dance that threatened to consume them both. Tanjiro could feel the sweat pouring down his brow, his lungs burning with each laboured breath, but he refused to give in to the exhaustion. This was a battle he couldn't afford to lose, not when so much was at stake. Tanjiro steeled his resolve, his eyes burning with unwavering determination as he continued to face off against the demon who had chosen to serve the very evil they had sworn to destroy. Tanjiro's muscles ached with every movement, the strain of the prolonged battle taking a toll on his body. His arms felt heavy, the constant parrying of Kaigaku's powerful strikes leaving them sore and trembling. The young demon slayer's head was starting to throb, the lack of proper sustenance taking its toll. The peach and water only provided a small burst of energy and it was quickly fading. Now, his body was running on fumes, his vision starting to blur as his blood sugar plummeted. Sweat poured down Tanjiro's face, his dark hair plastered to his brow. The air was thick with the scent of ozone, the electricity crackling around Kaigaku's sword leaving his skin tingling and his nerves raw. Each clash of their blades was harder than the last, the sheer force of Kaigaku's attacks leaving Tanjiro momentarily dazed. He struggled to keep up, his movements becoming more defensive as he desperately sought an opening in the demon's onslaught. Tanjiro knew he needed to find a way to land a decisive blow, but the task seemed daunting. Kaigaku's speed and raw power were overwhelming, and Tanjiro's exhaustion was making it increasingly difficult to capitalize on any potential weaknesses. Yet, the young demon slayer refused to give up. He gritted his teeth, his eyes narrowing with determination as he continued to dance around Kaigaku's attacks. Whenever he saw an opportunity, he would strike, but so far, his efforts had only resulted in glancing blows, each one failing to land the devastating hit he so desperately needed. Suddenly, Tanjiro saw his chance. Kaigaku's movements had become more erratic, his anger fueling his attacks but also making them more predictable. Tanjiro tensed, every muscle in his body coiled like a spring, ready to unleash a powerful counterattack. But as he prepared to strike, he noticed a shift in Kaigaku's demeanor. The demon's eyes had narrowed, a dangerous glint of fury flickering within them. Tanjiro knew he had to be careful. Kaigaku was becoming increasingly volatile, and his next moves were likely to be even more intense and violent. The young demon slayer's heart raced, his mind racing as he tried to anticipate Kaigaku's next move. He knew he couldn't afford to make a mistake, not when the stakes were so high. The fate of countless innocent lives hung in the balance, and Tanjiro was determined to do whatever it took to stop the demon and protect the people he cared about. Tanjiro's muscles coiled with tension as he observed Kaigaku's relentless onslaught, searching for any opening in the demon's furious assault. The air crackled with the energy of their deadly dance, the sound of metal clashing against metal ringing out like thunderclaps. Seizing his moment, Tanjiro darted forward, his movements swift and precise. Ducking under Kaigaku's outstretched arm, he surged into the demon's personal space, the broken sword in his hand poised to strike. With a swift, powerful move, Tanjiro plunged the blade to the hand guard into Kaigaku's ribs, the sharp deadly edges tearing through flesh and bone. Tanjiro wasted no time, twisting the sword sharply and dragging it upwards in a vicious arc. The blade ripped through Kaigaku's shoulder, severing muscle and tendons with a sickening crunch. A pungent stench of charred flesh and burnt nerves assaulted Tanjiro's senses as the fire-breathing technique seared the demon's body, causing his eyes to water and his nostrils to flare. Kaigaku's right arm and shoulder went limp, the gaping wound rendering the limb temporarily useless. Blood gushed from the gaping injury, spraying across the stained sand in a cruel arc. The crimson liquid soaked into Kaigaku's haori, transforming the pristine white fabric into a macabre canvas of reds and pinks. Staggering backward, Kaigaku let out a guttural scream of agony, his features contorted in a mask of pure fury. Raising his remaining hand, he unleashed a torrent of crackling black lightning, the searing energy arcing towards Tanjiro in a relentless barrage. Tanjiro recoiled, his reflexes just quick enough to avoid the brunt of the attack. The lightning seared the air around him, the heat and electricity making his skin tingle and his hair stand on end. Tanjiro stumbled back, putting distance between himself and the wounded demon. Tanjiro's heart raced as he watched the gruesome sight unfold before him. Though he had put some distance between himself and the wounded demon, he couldn't tear his gaze away from the macabre display of Kaigaku's regeneration. With morbid fascination, Tanjiro observed as the severed flesh and torn muscles began to knit themselves back together. Thin, crimson tendrils snaked across the gaping wound, the veins stretching and weaving like a living tapestry, stitching the ravaged tissues back into a semblance of wholeness. Tanjiro's stomach churned at the sight, but he forced himself to maintain his focus. He knew he didn't have much time before Kaigaku's demonic healing powers fully repaired the damage he had inflicted. The demon was already stirring, his remaining hand crackling with dark energy as he prepared to unleash another devastating barrage of lightning. Tanjiro braced himself, his muscles coiled like springs, ready to spring into action at a moment's notice. As Kaigaku unleashed the first searing bolt, Tanjiro reacted with lightning-fast reflexes, his body twisting and contorting to avoid the attack. The air around him crackled with electricity, the thunderous rumbles echoing across the battlefield. Tanjiro danced and weaved through the relentless barrage, his movements fluid and graceful, like a leaf caught in the wind. He couldn't afford to be struck by even a single bolt, the sheer power of Kaigaku's lightning could easily incinerate him. Inch by inch, Tanjiro closed the distance, his eyes narrowed with determination. He had to get close enough to strike a decisive blow, to sever Kaigaku's head and end this battle once and for all. The demon's regenerative abilities were a formidable obstacle, but Tanjiro knew that if he could land the killing blow, even Kaigaku's demonic powers wouldn't be able to save him. Tanjiro's lungs burned with exertion, his muscles aching from the constant strain of dodging and evading the lightning strikes. But he refused to give in to fatigue. He was so close now, close enough to feel the heat radiating from Kaigaku's body, to smell the acrid stench of charred flesh and ozone. With a final burst of speed, Tanjiro lunged forward, his sword held high, the blade glinting in the dim light. He saw the fear flash across Kaigaku's face, the demon's eyes widening in the realization that his end was near. Tanjiro steeled himself, his grip tightening on the hilt, as he prepared to deliver the fatal strike. Tanjiro grit his teeth as searing bolts of lightning sliced through the air, narrowly missing him but managing to graze his arm, the electricity searing through his clothing and searing his flesh. The pain was searing, but Tanjiro refused to let it slow him down. With every fiber of his being focused on the task at hand, Tanjiro pressed forward, his eyes locked onto Kaigaku's increasingly desperate expression. The demon's eyes widened in sheer terror as he realized just how close Tanjiro had gotten, the broken blade clutched tightly in the young demon slayer's hand. Tanjiro let out a primal roar, every muscle in his body coiled and ready to deliver the killing blow. He swung the sword in a diagonal arc, the serrated edge glinting in the dim light as it hurtled towards Kaigaku's exposed neck, intent on severing the demon's head from his shoulders. Time seemed to slow down as Tanjiro watched the blade descend, the roar of the crowd around them fading into a distant hum. He could see the panic on Kaigaku's face, the demon's own sword raised in a desperate attempt to parry the attack. But Tanjiro was faster, his focus unwavering. He poured every ounce of his strength into the swing, determined to end this battle once and for all. However, just as the blade was about to connect, Kaigaku's lightning erupted with renewed intensity. Black tendrils of electricity crackled through the air, lashing out at Tanjiro with blinding speed. Tanjiro had no time to react, the lightning striking him with a deafening thunderclap. Tanjiro's world erupted into a blinding maelstrom of searing agony as Kaigaku's devastating lightning bolt struck him head-on. The air crackled with the deafening roar of the thunderclap, the very ground seeming to tremble beneath the raw power of the demonic energy. Tanjiro's muscles spasmed and convulsed violently, his nerves alight with unbearable pain as the electricity coursed through his body. He could feel his flesh burning, the acrid stench of charred skin and singed hair filling his nostrils. Steam rose from his smoldering haori, the once vibrant fabric now scorched and blackened. A wet, metallic taste filled his mouth as he coughed up a mouthful of blood, the coppery liquid dribbling down his chin. The agony was all-consuming, a relentless torment that threatened to shatter his very will to live. Tanjiro's anguished scream echoed across the battlefield, his voice hoarse and raw from the strain. The lighting continued to lick at his prone form, dancing across his body in a macabre display of power. He could feel his consciousness slipping away, his vision dimming as the darkness threatened to consume him. His limbs grew heavy, his movements sluggish and uncoordinated as the electricity continued to ravage his body. Tanjiro's grip on his sword faltered, the broken blade clattering to the ground as he succumbed to the overwhelming power of Kaigaku's attack. Time seemed to slow to a crawl as Tanjiro's world narrowed to a singular point of blinding pain. Every nerve ending was alight with searing agony, the very air around him sizzling with the intensity of the electricity. Tanjiro's thoughts became disjointed, his mind struggling to cling to consciousness as the darkness threatened to consume him. He could hear the roar of the crowd, the frantic shouts of his allies, but it all sounded so distant, as if he were underwater, trapped in a world of muffled sounds and blurred vision. With a final, agonized gasp, Tanjiro's body went limp, the young demon slayer's world fading into a sea of blackness as he succumbed to the overwhelming power of Kaigaku's devastating lightning strike.